It's the 17th of January 1943. We're in a cellar under a bombed-out house in the ruins of Stalingrad, and a German officer named Heinrich Gerlach is doing his best to stay sane as he's repeatedly tormented by the rhythmic ticking of the clock, which echoes through the streets with a menacing consistency. In normal times, this routine sound, which marks the passage of time, would be mere background noise. But these are not normal times. Gerlach and his men are starving, frostbitten, injured, and vulnerable. With all this on their plate, the ticking away of the clock is enough to drive the men mad. One of his comrades starts eating his own belt before the rotten teeth crumble out of his gums and onto the frozen leather. Another believes he's back at home and finds himself locked in a sentimental conversation with a brick wall. The chattering and shivering would usually be enough to give away their position. After all, the enemy is only a few meters away. But thanks to the noisy ticking of the clock, they won't be heard. Not yet, at least. See, this ticking isn't coming from a timepiece in the room or from a clock tower in the city. Instead, it's coming from a series of loudspeakers that the enemy have installed all around the German positions. Although a cryptic message to us, for the soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad, the meaning could not be clearer. Time is running out. It's been only 4 months since the siege of Stalingrad commenced on the 13th of September 1942, but by now it's already become the bloodiest battle in human history, and it's about to get far worse for the German invaders. It's a fight which has already claimed up to 250,000 lives in some of the most unbelievably brutal and tragically banal ways possible. Some quietly freeze to death after weeks without food. Others are murdered savagely, bludgeoned to death with shovels in pitch-black sewers under the broken city. None of this is lost on Gerlach, who now ponders the last 4 months of horror as he's tormented by the monotonous tick, second by second. But to make certain that the message is fully driven home, the ticking of the clock is interrupted every couple of minutes, and a voice rings through the PA to taunt Gerlach and his frozen comrades. Your Führer has abandoned you. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Stalingrad. Surrender now. This is the story of the siege of Stalingrad. On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, an enormous invasion into Soviet Russia with the intention of completely knocking the USSR off the map. The plan was to establish a vast Eastern European frontier for the Third Reich to occupy. This would allow Germany unprecedented access to agricultural supplies, but most importantly, oil, with which to feed her ravenous war machine. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin had actually signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, so the invasion itself was a tremendous shock to the Soviet Union, an advantage that Hitler was hoping to press home in order to wrap up the fight before the Russians had a chance to get their act together. To quote the Führer directly, "You only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." And if you were watching from the sidelines, the opening events seemed to prove Hitler right. The further the Germans pushed into the Soviet Union, the more the Russian resistance withered away, and countless civilians suddenly found themselves under occupation by a foreign force which considered Slavs and other Eastern Europeans to be Untermenschen, or lesser people. Tens of thousands of civilians were summarily executed by their German occupiers, and those behind the line on the Soviet side suddenly began to harden their resolve in response to the brutality. Despite the astounding progress right out of the gate, by late 1931, the German war machine had begun to grind to a halt. Even though the Nazis had managed to march all the way to the outskirts of Moscow, the winter conditions had choked the offensive to a standstill, and a Russian counteroffensive would send the German vanguard packing. It was the first major defeat that Germany faced during the war, and it would be this bloody nose which sets the stage for the most brutal battle in human history. The historian Anthony Beevor writes that it was the first moment the myth of German invincibility was shattered. Bruised as they may have been, though, they were by no means ready to give up. While spending the winter of 1941 consolidating their positions in Soviet-held territories, the Germans began planning a new offensive for the summer of 1942, in which they would abandon their plan to wrestle Moscow out of Stalin's hands, and instead swing south, so that they could cut off the supply of Allied munitions into the Soviet Union and at the same time take control of the oil fields in the Caucasus. If successful, it would massively strengthen Germany's hand, whilst in the same move massively weaken Russia's and severely diminish her chances of ever launching a successful counter-offensive. The stakes were high. To quote Hitler directly, "If I do not get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, then I must call off this war." And to the Führer's relief, the German punch south had been an enormous success. The oil fields were looking very much within reach. But by mid-July 1942, the Wehrmacht found themselves dealing with some rather pokey resistance on the outskirts of a small city by the banks of the River Volga. Stalingrad. Although it held pretty minor strategic value, once the name of the town came across Hitler's desk, he immediately saw it as a primary target. After all, taking a city named in Stalin's honour would be quite the propaganda win. Hundreds of thousands of men would soon pay for this hubris in blood. To quote the historian Richard Overy, strategically, Stalingrad was a flank objective, not a primary one. But once the name was invoked, it assumed mythic proportions. Or, to use the words of Alan Clark, the city itself had no intrinsic value that justified the lives lost for it. But the psychological stakes were immense. And so, on the 23rd of July, Hitler intervened in the war plans and ordered that Stalingrad must be taken. Command of this crucial task was given to Friedrich Paulus, who headed the German 6th Army. 4 days later, on the 27th, Stalin responds in turn and issues Order 227, most famously known by its slogan, "Not a step back." As a result, any Soviet forces retreating without permission from command will be punished, and over the coming months, as many as 15,000 soldiers will be shot by firing squad for the crime of retreating. With this, Stalingrad, which should have been just a peripheral tactical objective, is about to become the turning point in the war, as both Hitler and Stalin allow their egos to cloud their strategic vision. During late July and early August, the fight kicks off and both sides suffer heavy losses as the Germans try to slam through the Russian lines with devastating mechanized assaults, and the Russians, forced to hold their ground on pain of death, absorb one punishing salvo after another, all the while refusing to budge. By mid-August, the Führer is losing his patience, and he orders a prolonged and quite frankly unprecedented bombing campaign on the city. To use his own words, Stalingrad must be erased from the face of the earth. It must cease to exist. We'll rub it out completely. And so on the 23rd of August, the bombing campaign begins, and over the coming weeks, the Luftwaffe will drop over 1,000 tons of explosives on the city, utterly levelling the infrastructure below. 90% of the buildings in Stalingrad are reduced to rubble. And lacking the power to challenge the skies above the city, the Soviets are simply forced to sit and wait as the destruction rains down onto the streets below. As if to make matters even worse, Stalin had decreed that the civilian population must remain inside the city, since the Red Army would be more likely to put up a good fight for a living city than they would for a ghost town. 500,000 people are now trapped between the German hammer and the Russian anvil. Once the German bombing raids come into full swing, the true horror begins to unfold. Civilians are crushed alive under fallen debris, slammed into walls by shockwaves, roasted alive in firestorms, or suffocated as their lungs are crushed by the compression blast from explosives. A Soviet nurse named Maria Limanskaya would later recall, "The city burned like a torch. The bombs sucked the oxygen from the air. We couldn't breathe." Between 40 to 75,000 people, mostly civilians, perish in the bombing campaign. But it all serves a purpose. Now that the defences have been softened up, the Germans can start to make a push into the city itself, and on the 13th of September, they press inwards with brutal efficiency, chasing the Soviet defenders out of every pocket they tried to hold on to. Russian casualties are astounding. But it won't be that easy. Behind the scenes, an experienced general named Vasily Chuikov takes the reins for the defense of Stalingrad. And he has a few ideas on how to turn the tide. Whereas others might see the utter destruction of an entire city as a tremendous strategic loss, Chuikov sees the chaos as a tactical advantage. See, the Germans like to fight by using their artillery, armour and aircraft in order to obliterate whichever target dares to stand in front of them. Chuikov realises he can use the rubble to deny them this advantage of overwhelming firepower. He gives his troops the order to hug the Germans. Stay close enough to the enemy and they won't be able to call in those fireworks, because they'll be in harm's way themselves. But how close is close enough? It's said that they should be no more than a grenade's throw away. With this order, the battle turns from a set-piece showdown between two mechanised armies into an absolutely brutal slog, street by street, building by building, room by room. A Soviet war correspondent named Vasily Grossman would go on to call it the most savage hand-to-hand battle in human history. Tanks become useless in the thick rubble. Heavy machine guns lose their tactical advantage without a field of view. And even everyday small arms like rifles with bayonets become too clunky to fit through tight doorways and stairwells. Instead, pistols, knives, shovels and grenades become the preferred tools for fighting. Men scrap day and night, often with their enemy in the next room of the same building. Engagements were random, arbitrary, unpredictable, with no battle lines or set formations. One particularly terrifying weapon became the flamethrower, which was used to preemptively singe any room, hallway, corridor, or hiding spot that was suspected to contain hidden enemies. Men were roasted alive as flames spat death into every corner. Soldiers reported that any enemy carrying this terrifying weapon became an immediate priority target. Sniping also became a go-to tactic, denying the men the opportunity to ever let their guard down. Those fetching water or carrying ammunition were routinely struck down to deny their comrades resupply in the heat of battle. To quote Anthony Beevor again, soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor. Cellars were stormed with grenades. A single building could change hands 4 times in a single day. It wasn't even war anymore. It was primitive hatred, fought with knives, spades, and bare hands. There was no front line in Stalingrad, only overlapping zones of death. It would go on like this for months, and the city itself turns into a meat grinder as both sides desperately try to muster new troops to send into the ruins. By November, the average life expectancy for a soldier in Stalingrad is 24 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig Wren of the Wehrmacht said that the street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Another German soldier wrote in a private letter home that the wounded lay in the snow with their entrails exposed, calling for their mothers. On the Russian side, Grossman would write that there were bodies lying in stairwells, frozen in grotesque positions. Sometimes you'd step over a man with his innards spilled out and his eyes frozen open. And a few steps later, there'd be a girl with half her head gone, leaning against a burnt wall like she was just resting. And while all of this is going on above the streets, there was an entire campaign of brutal violence taking place underground in the sewers. Groups of men would skulk silently in the pitch black, only to turn a corner and find another platoon doing the same. Screams of panic would ensue as soldiers scrambled over one another to bludgeon their enemies before they were extinguished themselves. Those that fell half dead would be trampled in the excrement of the sewers as their comrades fought tooth and nail for survival in desperate, frenzied melees, interrupted by spiteful bursts of machine gun fire, which resolved the dispute and left only the screams of the wounded. The Germans would go on to call it the Rattenkrieg, or the Rats' War. The Soviet veteran Ivan Dobrodobin remembers, "We had to take cellars and sewers. One time I climbed into a sewer and found it already occupied by a German with a bayonet. We fought in total darkness." One particularly costly engagement would go on to be immortalised as Pavlov's house, a four-storey building that the Soviets had managed to wrestle back from the Germans in mid-September. Once back under their control, a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov then oversaw a 2-month holdout against the German attackers and managed to cling on through weeks of some of the most intense fighting on Earth with just 30 men inside. Chukov would go on to joke that the Germans lost more men trying to take this one building than they did on the entirety of the march to Paris. But while the two armies slog it out in some of the most savagely violent fighting ever seen in human history, the civilians still alive in Stalingrad are trapped between the invisible front line, under constant threat of a stray grenade or shell tearing them apart. And after months of ducking and weaving between firefights, they're starting to succumb to starvation. One of the civilian survivors of Stalingrad, Zinaida Gogievna, was only a teenager during the ordeal. She remembers, "We ate wallpaper paste. We drank melted snow. I saw a boy shot for stealing a crust of bread. People disappeared when they went to fetch water. Shells would fall and the street would be gone. Just blood and mist." Savage beyond belief as all this was, though, Chuikov's plan had worked. Hugging the Germans had denied them their advantage in firepower, and the Soviets had bought themselves some much-needed time. On November 19th, 1942, Chuikov launched Operation Uranus. It was a massive, two-sided assault on the north and south flanks of the Axis forces just outside Stalingrad. The plan was to completely encircle the main army within the city, and it worked. Within 4 days, the two Soviet groups linked up at Kalak, and now 230,000 Axis soldiers were caught in the snare. This would have been a death sentence, as the Russian winter started to set its claws into the encircled soldiers. Without the ability to receive fresh supplies, they would begin to perish from starvation and disease, and would be unable to resist any Soviet attacks as their ammunition dwindled. Paulus, the general in command of the German forces inside the Encirclment, had actually begged Hitler for permission to retreat on the 19th of November, the day that the counter-offensive had begun. But he was told to stay and fight. Over the coming days and months, Paulus will continue to appeal to his Führer and try to convince him of the hopelessness of staying in this encircled position, as the Russian winter sweeps through Stalingrad and the men now trapped within it. He will go on to write that it was not a battle. It was a nightmare of fire and ice. Men went mad. We were encircled not just by the Red Army, but by the silence of death. The trap that the Germans were encircled within became known as the Kessel, an area around 50 kilometres wide and 40 kilometres deep, surrounding the ruins of the city. It was here that things would go from bad to worse. By December, temperatures dropped to as low as minus 30 degrees centigrade, and since they were encircled, they were unable to access any winter clothing. Frostbite and gangrene became regular fixtures. A German medic would recall that the wounded screamed until their lungs froze. Then they just stared. What was left inside the Kessel wasn't really an army anymore. It was a collection of trapped, desperate, and hopeless men, armed with whatever weapons and ammo was left, frantically trying to scrape together enough to survive, whilst avoiding being picked off by the Soviet marksmen laying in wait on the edges. Caloric intake dwindled to a few hundred calories a day. Forced to stay under cover for fear of sniper fire, soldiers were left with no option but to relieve themselves in the basements and rooms that they were hiding in. As a consequence, dysentery and typhus ripped through the survivors with merciless results. Behind the front line, half-hearted plans are put together, either to break the encirclement with reinforcements or to airlift Paulus fresh supplies, in order to give his trapped soldiers just enough food and ammo to keep up the fight. None of these plans bear fruit, and those inside the Kessel are left to fend for themselves. Some 250,000 men. November came and went, then December, then Christmas, and by January, the jig was up. And so we find ourselves back in the frozen, corpse-ridden streets, which would be drowned in hopeless silence, if not for the ticking of a clock. Suicidal men that had exhausted their ammunition were seen picking through the snow in a search for stray bullets, fighting against the stubborn rubble with frost-bitten hands, thawing inside gloves stolen from corpses, just for the chance to find a bullet with which to shoot themselves through the head and escape the horror. Others, deliriously hungry and half mad, were found eating soap or wandering around in a daze, obliviously vulnerable and out in the open. Friedrich Paulus sees this and comes to the grim realization that he's no longer able to keep control over what was left of his men. He told Hitler that his army was a spent force and that surrender was inevitable. To be honest, it would be inaccurate to call what Paulus had an army. In reality, it was a desperate mob. But Hitler was unmoved and told Paulus to fight to the last. With this final order, he gave Paulus a promotion to Field Marshal on the 30th of January 1943. It was not an act of encouragement or approval. It was a subtle order. No Field Marshal had ever surrendered to the enemy in German history, and Paulus, now a Field Marshal himself, was expected to continue this legacy and fight to the death or die by his own hand. His response was one of complete defiance. I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bavarian corporal. With this, he made his decision, and the next day, on January the 31st, he surrendered himself and his forces to the Red Army. When Paulus was actually captured by Soviet troops, they found him sitting in complete silence, dazed and expressionless, in a filthy, freezing room surrounded by exhausted and wounded staff. Soviet officer General Ivan Laskin later recalled, he looked like a living corpse, pale, unshaven, broken. He didn't even get up when we entered. But it wasn't just the newly promoted Field Marshal who was in bad shape. Of the 230,000 men that had originally been trapped inside the Russian encirclement, only 90,000 were still alive by the time of the surrender. The other 140,000 had been killed, starved, frozen, or had quietly succumbed to the ravages of disease. And of the 90,000 men that did live to surrender, only around 5,000 ever made it back to Germany alive. The rest would perish in brutal Soviet POW camps. The human cost was unimaginable for both sides, and it remains the bloodiest battle in human history. But Stalingrad also marks the turning point of the Second World War in Europe, and from this moment onwards, Germany will find itself on the defensive as the Red Army grinds towards Berlin. The final death count for the battle would be between 250 to 300,000 individuals, forced to fight and die in the snow, all in the name of hubris and ego. It's sometime in the 1940s. A medical technician named Naokata Ishibashi is on duty in a secret research facility just outside Harbin in northern China. Although the facility is officially classified as part of the Center for Disease Prevention and Water Purification, what goes on here is in reality far, far darker, forever stamped on history as Unit 731, an event filled with horror and human experimentation utterly beyond moral comprehension. As Ishibashi does the rounds, he's stopped by two prisoners who beg him for help, a Chinese girl aged 21 and a 19-year-old Ukrainian who ask Ishibashi if he could lend them a mirror. They explain to him that since they've been imprisoned within the unit, they haven't had the opportunity to see their own faces, and they want to know if they'd still be able to recognize themselves after the weeks of malnutrition, disease, violence, and fear. It's a painfully human request from individuals that Ishibashi has been taught to see as simple subjects for medical tests. As a matter of fact, in the unit's official records, every prisoner in the camp is referred to as Maruta, the Japanese word for a log. This euphemism even goes so far as to call the girls' accommodation the log cabin. And as for the girls themselves, they're known individually by just a 3-digit number, their names being taken from them the moment they entered. But here they both are, one from China, one from Ukraine, both determined to remind themselves of their own identity, risking the most unimaginable torture possible, just to take that very human act of looking at one's own face in the mirror before one dies. Moved by this request, Ishibashi gives the girls a mirror, which he has to meticulously sneak through a hole in the cell door. And for good reason. He's been told anyone showing kindness to the subjects would be brutally punished, and by now, he has seen enough brutality firsthand to believe it. We don't know what the girls saw in their reflection, but we know what happened next, because 40 years later in 1981, this same Naokata Ishibashi would give public testimony to a war crime tribunal in Tokyo. To use his exact words, "I gave them that mirror, but I couldn't save them. They died horribly, like so many others. I still remember their voices." Later on, Ishibashi would find out exactly how the girls had perished when he overheard colleagues discussing a medical experiment in which they'd cut into the two girls whilst still alive, one Ukrainian and one Chinese. Ishibashi said to the tribunal, "Later, I learned that both of them had been vivisected. They were used for experiments and died on the operating table." They were one of at least 400,000 people who died as a result of what happened here. This is the story of Unit 731, and fair warning, this opening chapter is the most uplifting part of what we'll cover today. Although it's absolutely tragic and horrific, there is at least some sense of shared humanity and compassion in Ishibashi's testimony. He comes across as a man caught in a broken system who acts with kindness where he can, even if he is unable to change the broader story, and then finally breaks the silence at a tribunal with honesty and responsibility. The rest of the video won't be like this. It's all downhill from here, and I mean it. If you're squeamish or sensitive, walk away. I won't blame you. I'm making this video by popular demand from my subscribers and had purposefully tried to keep this topic at arm's length until now. I always knew bits about Unit 731. I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was this bad. Some of the research for this video moved me to tears, but it really happened. And like the girls who just wanted to see themselves in the mirror, we owe it to ourselves to look our past square in the face and bring some redemption to the victims who deserve to have their story told. Lastly, I will have to be purposefully obscure with some of the language I use in this video, and it's not an attempt to downplay or de-emphasize the horror of what happened, but merely to make sure that the video itself doesn't get struck down. With that said, let's go. On the 17th of June 1925, the nations of the world gathered to sign something called the Geneva Protocol, an agreement between states that they would never again use chemical or biological weapons against one another. Just a decade before, Europe had been torn apart by the deadlock of the First World War, which saw the first ever mass-scale use of chemical agents on the battlefield. Up to 1 million casualties from the First World War were a result of these poisonous gases, and since they were by their nature indiscriminate weapons, many of those affected were civilians. The world was determined that never again would this hell be unleashed onto the face of the earth to work its way into the lungs, eyes and throats of anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the wake of these deathly clouds. To get a sense of just how awful the effects of these weapons were, you need only look at Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce Est. As under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer. Grim as it sounds, this is typical for chlorine gas poisoning, which sets in within seconds of exposure as the linings of the airways inflame and fill with fluid. Victims drown alive while their mouths fill with foam. Those lucky enough to survive are left with permanent lung damage. But as all this horror was unfolding in Europe, the Japanese military watched on closely and studied the carnage in the trenches. They concluded that chemical weapons were going to be an integral part of any future war. To them, the fact that all these nations had come together to sign the Geneva Protocol was just more proof that chemical weapons were indispensable to a modern army. And to an extent, they weren't wrong. By 1918, somewhere in the region of 1 in every 3 hand grenades contained a chemical agent. Despite the immediate use that the Japanese military saw for the weapons, though, Japan herself did ultimately sign up to the treaty, which meant that they had now publicly promised to wash their hands of all chemical and biological weapons. But by 1927, an up-and-coming army surgeon named Shiro Ishii started advocating for the development of a Japanese bioweapons program, and although his enthusiasm was met positively by those in command, politically, it simply wasn't an option. If Japan was ever going to develop or use these capabilities, it would need to do so with the utmost secrecy, and preferably far away from the prying eyes and vulnerable cities of the Japanese home islands. But luckily for Ishii, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded Manchuria on September 18th, 1921, and within just 5 months, Japan would have this enormous region of northeast China firmly under her thumb. Not only did this mean that there was a chance to conduct experiments in relative secrecy, but also far away from any major population centre at home, and on top of that, there was now an abundance of that most crucial resource for experimentation: test subjects. By 1932, Ishii and other leading scientists were sent to Manchuria, where they could do their work in a new facility based out of a prison in Zhongma Fortress. With an influx of fresh test subjects in the form of political dissidents, common criminals, and those resisting the Japanese occupation, the researchers wasted no time getting to work. Once prisoners were labelled healthy, the experiments would begin. People were purposefully infected with the bubonic plague, or drained of blood at regular intervals to see how long they would last, and then vivisected, often while still alive and under no anaesthetic, so that the research staff could poke around the body and observe the state of the entrails throughout each stage of an infection or illness. However, what Zhongma Fortress may have had in horror, it lacked in security. In 1934, there was a prison break, and in 1935, an explosion erupted within the facility. Fearing that escaped prisoners might spread the word of what was going on behind these walls, the base was closed down. But Imperial Japan wasn't giving up. In fact, they were just getting started. A brand new facility was constructed, much larger, and this time around 25 kilometers south of Harbin, allowing for extra prisoners and extra security. And who better to lead this new research centre than the bioweapons enthusiast Shiro Ishii, who has recently enjoyed a promotion to senior army surgeon after his 3 years of diligent work in Jongma Base. It is at this stage that things go from bad to worse. And remember, this torment would go on for 9 years. Most of the prisoners who suffered in Unit 731 would have been sent there more or less arbitrarily, the majority of which were Chinese civilians under occupation or prisoners of war who surrendered whilst resisting the Japanese invasion. A sizable portion of Russians would also fall victim, and even some European and American souls would meet their ends here. When the prisoners arrived at the facility, they would be driven through the gates in a blacked-out car, and then once processed, would be led into a tunnel which would take them from the innocent-looking facade into the actual quarters, where they could be privately subjected to the most unspeakable fates, all under the innocent guise of disease prevention. Names were replaced with numbers, men and women were divided into separate quarters. At first, Unit 731 restricted itself purely to research around biological warfare, intentionally infecting victims with all manner of diseases, including the plague, typhoid, dysentery, anthrax, even venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea, which will come up in more detail later. Most of the time, these would be injected directly into the victims under the guise of a vaccination, and then the subjects would be examined as they declined in health, often, as we said, being vivisected alive and then discarded once the researchers had the information they needed. One surgeon at the unit anonymously testified to the New York Times about a vivisection involving a man who had been deliberately infected with the plague. To quote, "The fellow knew that it was over for him, and so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me, because it was my first time." Horrific as all this is, it wouldn't take long before Ishii and the other staff at the facility started to go beyond their officially sanctioned research and move into other areas of investigation. Conventional weapons testing became a staple part of the research, with prisoners being arranged in concentric rings around a live grenade to see at what range the blast would be lethal, what would cause a severe wound, or what would be survivable. Those who did survive with serious wounds would then be treated so that the medical staff could hone their battlefield medicine and come up with new techniques to deal with limbs blown off, organs peppered with shrapnel, or skin burned to crisp. Similar experiments would also be conducted with flamethrowers, chemical bombs, lining up prisoners behind one another and firing directly into them with pistols or rifles to measure bullet penetration, and 100 other such cruelties that I'll leave you to imagine. By the 1940s, the research on biological weapons had advanced to the stage where Shiro Ishii and the others within the facility were confident that they had found a way to turn the horror of biological warfare from a theoretical possibility to an actual reality, and started conducting experiments outside the unit and onto the surrounding population. One particularly renowned field trial was the attack on Chengde in 1941, which led to approximately 10,000 casualties and 1,700 deaths from cholera. Over the course of the war, a further 11 Chinese cities were attacked in this way, as poisoned candy was handed out to starving children, infected clothing was distributed to impoverished locals, plague fleas encased in porcelain bombs were scattered over households, and contaminated supplies were left free in town centres. An estimated 1,000 Chinese civilians died as their communities were ripped apart by plague, anthrax, typhoid, or cholera. Meanwhile, the researchers at the base benefit from this horror show in unexpected ways. Published research starts to appear in peer-reviewed journals detailing the effects of X disease in Y conditions. Doctors and medical students around the world would be consuming this monstrous output of scientific inquiry, painfully unaware of the human cost behind the data, since the researchers had published their findings under the guise that it had been performed on long-tailed primates or Manchurian monkeys. But while things go swimmingly for the research staff, treatment within Unit 731 would continue to worsen for the inmates, as all pretense of scientific investigation gives way to macabre fascination and inhuman cruelty. Inmates were subjected to dual amputations before having the limbs reattached back to front or on the wrong side of the body. In one case, someone's torso was cut open, the stomach was removed, and the intestines were reattached directly to the esophagus, all without anaesthetic, and all just to see what would happen. Another man who would go on to testify to what happened, this time a professor at Kyoto University named Nakagawa Yonezo, said the following: "Some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around. Professional people, too, like to play." To this end, thousands more would be treated as though they were mere resources to be used and discarded, with brutal violence being a constant threat for anybody who tried to resist or avoid being a test subject. And all the while, the morbid curiosity of the staff became more and more insatiable. For the head honcho of all of this, Shiro Ishii, the value of life declines well below anything that we could recognize as human. The historian Sheldon Harris tells us that if Ishii or one of his co-workers wanted to do research on the human brain, then they would order the guards to find them a useful sample. A prisoner would be taken from his cell, guards would hold him, while another guard would smash the victim's head open with an axe. His brain would be extracted off to the pathologist, and then to the crematorium for the usual disposal. I could spend the whole day talking about each individual horror story that I've come across, and we would still not exhaust the list. It's that bad. But one cannot fully grasp the horror of Unit 731 until we consider the treatment of women and children. In an effort to measure the spread of venereal diseases, the researchers swapped out the method of injecting their victims with the disease and instead would simply force prisoners to copulate with one another at gunpoint until they were satisfied that it had been transferred. Countless women in various stages of pregnancy were subjected to this fate in order to fully understand the effects of certain diseases on the development of a baby, and those babies, once born, would not be spared their mother's torment. One particularly cruel researcher named Hisata Yoshimura conducted several tests on the impact of frostbite on the body, including one experiment in which the hands of a 3-year-old child were soaked in water containing ice and salt until the frost took hold. Others would have limbs frozen until they hardened to the point at which he could hit them with a stick and they would, quote, emit a sound resembling that which a board gives when it is struck. It goes on and on like this, over and over, horror after horror. Men dehydrated in superheated rooms until they finally expire at 20% of their usual body weight. Victims thrown into gas chambers to measure how long one can survive if the dosage is varied. Blood transfusions with the wrong blood type, simply to see what would happen. It's just layers upon layers of cruelty and suffering. And It's worth noting that all of the first-hand accounts we have of what happened in Unit 731 come to us from the staff and guards that worked there. No survivor accounts exist because no one survived. Every single soul who was sent to Unit 731 died there, most of which within 2 months of entering. One dreads to imagine what further depravity would be uncovered if the victims themselves could speak. Eventually, the staff themselves begin to fall victim to the horror when one employee within the unit, named Pseudo, became sick with the bubonic plague. He immediately switched from a valued member of the team to just another subject. To quote an eyewitness who saw the whole affair, "After Pseudo's body was carefully checked, I handed a scalpel to the surgeon, who, reversely gripping the scalpel, touched Pseudo's stomach skin and sliced downward. Pseudo shouted, 'Brute,' and died with this last word." As you can imagine, many people tried to resist this unimaginable fate, including one incident in which the prisoners attempted to start a riot after overpowering one of their guards. When the facility staff refused to negotiate with the prisoners, one of them demanded that the staff shoot him rather than use him for these depraved experiments. He was, as requested, cut down without hesitation. Another eyewitness who was part of the staff would later say that, "Spiritually, we were lost in front of the prisoners who had no freedom and no weapons. At that time, we understood in our hearts that justice was not on our side." And by 1945, 9 years and countless souls after the experiments had begun, that opportunity for justice came knocking when Japan surrendered, officially ending the Second World War and finally opening up the process of trying leaders in the Japanese military for their war crimes. In a desperate attempt to hide their sins, the entire research facility staff began to shred all of their paperwork, burn any and all evidence, and execute every remaining prisoner before finally fleeing back to the homeland. The cover-up didn't work. Shiro Ishii was arrested by the United States during its occupation of Japan, and Ishii would finally face his judgment at the 1946 Japanese war crimes prosecution before the Tokyo Tribunal. But tragically, he was able to negotiate a deal with the US. In exchange for complete and utter immunity, he would promise to share the full details of the research with the United States. Despite the fact that much of this research had been lost in the attempt to destroy evidence, the US took the deal, and Shiro Ishii would live another 14 years as a free man, never facing justice for his actions and dying peacefully in his bed in 1959 at 67 years of age and immensely wealthy, having not, even for a moment, shown an ounce of contrition, regret, or guilt. To add insult to injury, this supposedly invaluable research data turned out to be useless. When American scientists scoured through the logs, what they found was miles behind the US research and was of little to no significance. Tens of thousands of people had been subjected to the most unthinkable ends for absolutely nothing, and a known monster was allowed to walk free in exchange for information that was of no use to anyone. Unit 731 showed us practically nothing about medicine, chemical weapons, or the limits of the human body. The only truth it released is the limitless capacity we have for the most extreme cruelty and sadism. As for the rest of the scientists, many of those also never faced justice, and there was a similar deal struck with a handful of Japanese scientists who managed to find themselves on trial by the USSR, although some did receive several years of hard labour. This is hardly a fitting sentence, but at least it was something. Ironically, the Soviet Union would later go on to build a biological weapons facility in Sverdlovsk using documentation that was acquired from the staff at Unit 731. This facility would go on to kill at least 68 people during an incident in the 1970s in which anthrax was accidentally exposed to the general population. Within Japan itself, the government has been extremely reluctant to accept responsibility for what happened. In 1983, the Ministry of Education was still trying to censor works by Japanese historians on what actually happened in Unit 731, and it wouldn't be until 2018, a staggering 70 years after the horrors ended, that the names of those individuals were ever released to the public. All of this cover-up had grim results. Given that these scientists never faced any kind of justice for their crimes, they were free to pursue their scientific careers elsewhere. Some scientists even went on to found the Green Cross pharmaceutical company, which would later get wrapped up in an enormous scandal after 3,000 Japanese citizens contracted HIV through the use of the company's blood products. The consequences of letting monsters roam unchecked would resonate down the ages, not just for those who suffered within Unit 731, but for the modern academics who were punished for trying to expose the truth, for the civilians near Sverdlovsk whose lives were ruined or ended by anthrax poisoning, and the Japanese population themselves, as 3,000 of them would contract a life-altering illness. If there is a moral of the story here, it's best summed up in HBO's Chernobyl that every time we lie, we incur a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, that debt is paid. First, it was the lie that Unit 731 was just a disease prevention centre, which allowed Japan to hide its real intentions and remain compliant with the Geneva Protocol. This lie costed the lives of at least 10,000 prisoners within the unit itself and hundreds of thousands of people outside who were used as guinea pigs for biological war tests. Then it was the lie that it never happened, which allowed those same monsters to walk among us and ruin more lives, having never once faced justice in theirs. This leads me to the testimony given by Nakata Ishibashi and the others, who showed their faces to the world and told everyone what they were a part of and what had happened. I find these individuals the most difficult to judge. Even if they weren't personally sadistic, they were part of the machinery of sadism and were responsible for some of the worst cruelties ever seen in history. But on the other hand, they did have the moral courage to stand up, take responsibility for their actions, and share the truth. Without their choice to give public testimony, the countless who suffered at their hands would have never had a voice and would be forever forgotten. I will leave the judgment of these individuals who broke the silence to you watching. After thinking about Unit 731 for a few days, I couldn't help but be reminded of the Stanford prison experiment conducted in 1971 by Philip Zombardi, a professor of psychology. During the experiment, participants were divided into prisoners and guards. The guards were given the job of maintaining order for 2 weeks, and to this end, they were given almost complete freedom and total authority over the prisoners. What Zombardi found was an almost immediate decline of moral conduct amongst the guards, as the prisoners were subjected to more and more acts of cruelty and barbarism. There was a race to the bottom of human behaviour, and as a result, the experiment was cancelled within just 6 days. It strikes me as a very similar set of circumstances and outcomes to what happened in the facilities in China, where researchers far away from prying eyes were given near complete authority over their subjects, not for 6 days, but for 9 years. Tragically, there was a similar nosedive in human conduct, resulting in horrors that are quite frankly beyond comprehension, and seemingly for no other reason than because we can. I think it's very telling that when push came to shove, The staff destroyed the vast majority of their findings rather than be exposed for the monstrosity of their actions. It was never about the research. If it was that valuable, they would have kept it. All of this cruelty, all of this suffering and grief and heartache and tears had as much to do with research as it had to do with disease prevention. The depressing reality is that all of this was a pointless exercise in power, and the staff knew it. It's February the 13th, 1945. We're in Dresden, in eastern Germany. 9-year-old Lothar Metzger is at home with his mother and 4 sisters when he hears the wail of an air raid siren sounding across the city. Lothar isn't too concerned about this though. Dresden has largely been spared the wholesale destruction that's rained down on Germany in the last few years. There are few military targets here too. In the Florence of the Elbe, so named for its striking Baroque-style architecture and rich cultural history. There are just people here, civilians, but also there are prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war being kept here. Dresden is safe. It must be. Some of the city's residents would even joke that the Luftwaffe left the dreaming spires of Oxford alone, so the RAF will leave Dresden alone. So Lothar and his family calmly head downstairs to the cellar and wait for it all to blow over. But it doesn't. First the drones of the bombers, and then the explosions come. And they keep coming. They're getting closer now, those bombs. Closer to where Lothar and his family are cowering. Then the lights go out and the family cling to one another in utter darkness. Another strike. Then another. Lothar's own house is hit. The cellar filling with smoke and flame. Escaping into the street, Lothar glimpses the destruction wrought upon the city he calls home. We saw terrible things. Cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children. Pieces of arms and legs. Dead people. Whole families burnt to death. I cannot forget these terrible details. I can never forget them. Tonight, the Allies had done what no one had expected them to do. And by the time they'd finished, the city and its people would never be the same. This is the story of Dresden. So, you've just got off a pretty grueling flight to a faraway destination. All you want to do is get to your hotel, drop your bags off and get to it. But first, you've got to go to some dodgy airport sim counter and stand in line with everyone else who's just landed just to get massively overcharged for the most basic of services, or worse, rely on your usual sim for roaming, and once again, rack up an extortionate bill just to stay online while you find your way to the hotel. That's where Saily comes in. Saily is an eSIM app that lets you get mobile data in over 150 countries instantly. No physical SIM, no hidden fees, no standing in dodgy airport kiosks hoping someone speaks your language. You just download the app, pick a plan, and you're connected. That's it. Right now, you can get an exclusive 15% discount on any Saily data plan when you use my link and enter the code FLASHBACK at checkout. It's quick, it's affordable, and it works wherever you go. Travel smarter with Saily. Right from the very beginning, strategic urban bombing raids were among World War II's defining features. The rickety flying machines that developed so quickly during the First World War had become hulking, armour-plated fortresses by the Second, and they were deployed basically straight away. In September 1939, German bombers devastated Warsaw in Poland, killing around 10,000 civilians in a single day. The 8-month-long Blitz between 1940 and 1941 killed around 43,000 in Britain. But the Allies could certainly give as good as they got. The British raid on Cologne in 1942 saw 868 planes drop 1,455 tons of ordnance, while the American 9th Air Force's bombing of the Ploesti oilfields in 1943 seriously hobbled Germany's ability to keep their armoured divisions mobile. But maybe words like strategic bombing are too sanitised. While raids tended to have a military objective, they were notoriously imprecise and shockingly brutal. What we're really dealing with here is something like opening a walnut with a sledgehammer. Heavy bombing raids simply obliterated everything and everyone in their path, military target and civilian collateral alike. Everyone knew this fact. Many simply did not care. One such indifferent soul was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, better known today as Bomber Harris, the head of the RAF's Bomber Command. Early in the war, Harris and his staff formulated a plan to make war untenable for the Nazis. The coldness of their maths is staggering. They'd need 900,000 kills, they calculated, leaving 1 million injured and 25 million homeless. Achieve all that in 18 months, the RAF believed, and the Nazi government would collapse. This would mean specifically targeting civilians, and Harris had no problem with this. In 1941, he said, "For a long time, the government has preferred the world to think that we still held some scruples, and attacked only what the humanitarians are pleased to call military targets. I can assure you, gentlemen, that we tolerate no scruples." The Americans, too, believed in the power of heavy bombing. As the historian Dr. Hattie Hearn tells us, the popular belief in the US was that the war would be won by long-range heavy bomber aircraft fighting a strategic bombing war, a doctrine advocated by a group of US Army officers known as the Bomber Mafia. But standing in the way of these lofty Allied plans was the Luftwaffe, and they were not going to let their cities be obliterated. In 1943, the newly created American 8th Air Force suffered bitter casualties. On October 10th alone, 12 of the 13 planes on a raid over Münster were shot out of the sky. They'd lose 13 more over Schweinfurt 4 days later. Throughout 1943, 3/4 of the 8th's aircrews would be killed, wounded or captured before completing their 25-mission tour. It was grim, thankless and dangerous work for the Allies. To get a feel for the horror of it all, you need look no further than Randall Jarrell's poem, The Death of a Turret Gunner. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Horrendous as it was for all involved, this aerial struggle was about to shift in the Allies' favour. The addition of range-extending fuel drop tanks to the P-51 Mustang fighter in 1943 meant that the Allies could escort their bombers all the way into German territory and back. Germany's own aviation experiments, on the other hand, were less successful. Innovations like the rocket-powered Messerschmitt Me-163 proved ineffective. Meanwhile, the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union left Germany dangerously overstretched. By May 1944, the Allies had essentially achieved airborne mastery over Europe. That month, a radio operator named Hubert Ritz wrote home to his fiancée, "It will soon be time for this circus to come to an end. Otherwise, there will be no city in the whole of Germany that has not been destroyed." Sadly for Ritz, and for Germany's civilian population, he would turn out to be correct. By February 1945, Germany had been pulverised under the Allied onslaught. Every major city in the country was flattened. Thriving centres of commerce, culture, and humanity turned into twisted husks of skeletal rubble. Every major city, except one, Dresden. But even that was about to change. But the fate of Dresden was not sealed on the airfields of Lincolnshire or in the Bomber Command and 8th Air Force offices at High Wycombe, at least not initially. Instead, Dresden's death sentence was drafted further east, in Yalta, on the Crimean Peninsula. Here, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met to discuss what the world would look like once all this war was over, and the steps required to get there. The ongoing Red Army advance on Germany was high on the agenda. General Alexei Antonov wanted British and American air power to support Soviet troops by hitting targets in eastern Germany. It seemed a simple enough request, and the British and Americans agreed. And so, as the Yalta Conference drew to a close on February the 11th, Dresden became a target. 2 days later, on February 13th, it was Karnevalsdienstag, or Carnival Tuesday, Germany's answer to Shrove Tuesday, and the celebrations can be seen across Dresden. Despite the dreary wartime atmosphere, young Lothar Metzger has had a good day. He celebrated the carnival with other children, and now he looks forward to his 10th birthday, just 3 days away. Lothar can't know this yet, but the only reason he's had such a pleasant day is because hundreds of miles away in England, the American 8th Air Force have changed their plans. Bad weather has delayed the 8th's customary daylight bombing runs, so they sit tight at base. For Dresden, though, all of this is just a stay of execution. RAF Bomber Command experiences no such delay. Their first planes are in the air and on the way to their targets by 5:20 p.m. By 6 p.m, 2 more groups are airborne. It takes over 4 hours for the first wave to approach the city. When they come from the northwest, a low drone signalling their arrival. They roll over the Friedrichstadt district at less than 13,000 feet, en route to the city's historic centre, Altstadt. They are in flak range, but there's no flak to hit them. The anti-aircraft batteries have been removed and redeployed in Germany's rapidly narrowing territory. The bomber crews are relaxed. They know there'll be no opposition tonight, no group of Messerschmitts to swoop in to Dresden's aid. With this impunity, they can get in as close as they like and inflict maximum damage. The siren sounds. Initially, the populace are unbothered. False alarms are a feature of Dresden life, and even on the rare occasion that raids do hit the city, they drop a few bombs on the rail yards and things are left at that. But a message over the radio suggests that this time it's different. A great air raid is on its way, the announcer says, his voice trembling, bigger than anything Dresden has ever seen. The first bombs begin to fall at 10:15 p.m. In just a quarter of an hour, 880 tons rain down on Dresden's old town. Buildings, centuries old, tumble into piles of rubble. Streets are torn up, entire neighbourhoods destroyed, and Dresden's population, powerless to do anything, cower wherever they can. To make matters worse, this first wave wasn't even supposed to be the raid's main thrust. The initial wave carries a calculated mix of high explosives designed to rip open buildings, fill the streets with rubble and wood, and overwhelm the emergency response on the ground. But it's the second wave that will turn Dresden into something from a nightmare, where bombers will drop mostly incendiary weapons onto the city. With the exposed timber, shredded kindling from houses blown open, and building roofs ripped off, the flames will be able to tear through the city with terrifying ease. It's a 1-2 punch that allows the Allied bombers to create an artificial firestorm inside the city. The tactic had actually been used in Hamburg in 1943 with horrifying results. And in Dresden, this carefully devised formula works just as expected. The exposed wood ignites like tinder when hit. The percussive shock waves of the high explosive bombs fan these fires, whipping the city into a destructive hurricane of flame. 18-year-old Gottsbergander is stunned by the almighty force of the flames ripping through the city. There was an indescribable roar in the air. The fire, the thundering fire, reminded me of the biblical catastrophes that I had heard about. I was aghast. That fire became a furious white and yellow, and the sky was just one massive mountain of cloud. As the planes fade away into the night, the city's fire department fights desperately to bring the blaze under control. There are at least 1,000 firefighters in Dresden alone, their ranks swelled further by the crews from nearby cities. But this is not enough to stifle the blaze. Not nearly. Driven from their shelter after their home was hit, the young Lothgar Metzer with his mother and sisters flee out into the aftermath of that first raid. We did not recognize our street anymore. Fire. Only fire wherever we looked. Our 4th floor didn't exist anymore. The broken remains of our house were burning. On the streets there were burning vehicles and carts with refugees, people, horses, all of them screaming and shouting in fear of death. I saw hurt women, children, old people searching for a way through ruins and flames. As well as Dresden's civilians, thousands of Allied prisoners of war are present in the city too, captured from the battlefields of Arnhem and the Ardennes. Paratrooper Victor Gregg, taken prisoner during Operation Market Garden, remembers. Phosphorus from the incendiaries clung to the bodies of those below, turning them into human torches. The screaming of those who were being burned alive was added to the cries of those not yet hit. But the Allies aren't done. After midnight, the sirens go up again. Another wave comes in, from the west this time, and more than double the size of the first. Central Dresden is by now a vast pulsing mass of flame, not so much lit up as completely consumed by the inferno that now writhes across it. Historian Sinclair Mackay describes how the second wave bomber crews found it almost beautiful from the sky. He quotes one airman who said, chillingly, it was like a lattice work of molten gold. On the ground, though, there is, of course, no such beauty. Dresden is in the grips of utter panic. As more bombs fall, Lothar and his family find another shelter, a shared space packed with their injured, traumatized neighbours. But in the cramped conditions, claustrophobic terror sets in. They can't stay here either, and in the struggle to leave, the dead and dying are trampled in a crush. When they get outside, things are no better. Those fleeing burning buildings are driven back inside by the ferocity of the firestorm. In the chaos, the basket in which Lothar's twin baby sisters were placed is lost. Then Lothar's elder sister is lost too. Throughout the night, Lothar's distraught mother will run from house to house in a frantic search for her missing daughters. Across the city, Dresden's residents are struggling to come to terms with the horror unfolding around them. Margaret Freyer sees a woman lose her baby to the flames. The surging gale force winds produced by the fire had simply ripped the child from her arms. To my left, I suddenly saw a woman. She carries a bundle in her arms. It's a baby. She runs, she falls, and the child flies in an arc into the fire. Margaret pushes on through the horror, but is mystified to see people just dropping dead around her. They scream and gesticulate with their hands, and then, to my utter horror and amazement, I see how one after the other they simply seem to let themselves drop to the ground. It's only later that she'll understand what's actually happening. Today I know that these unfortunate people were the victims of a lack of oxygen. They fainted and then burnt to cinders. By now, the heat is unimaginably intense. As historian Donald Miller says, people's shoes melted into the hot asphalt of the streets, and the fire moved so swiftly that many were reduced to atoms before they had the time to remove their shoes. Some met horrific ends in a futile effort to flee the flames. To quote the paratrooper Victor Gregg again, there were 3 big concrete water tanks built in the middle of Dresden. As it got hot, people jumped in to escape the heat. Eventually, the water boiled and they couldn't get out. They were being boiled alive. Dresden would be hit again over the next 2 days, subsequent raids restarting her fires and sowing more death and destruction across the city. Fires raged for weeks, as those still living set about the grim task of identifying and disposing of the dead. Propaganda recalled how the smell of burning bodies hung in the air, as corpses were soaked in benzene and set alight. Future novelist Kurt Vonnegut had been taken prisoner at the Battle of the Bulge. He was an American prisoner in Dresden on the night of the raid. In the days following, he and his comrades were among those tasked with recovering the bodies, many of which were entombed in the shelters meant to keep them safe. They didn't smell bad at first, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied. The stink was like roses and mustard gas. A new technique was devised. Bodies weren't brought up anymore. They were cremated by soldiers with flamethrowers. The soldiers stood outside the shelters and simply sent the fire in. Vonnegut's account is fictionalized, but it's certainly inspired by the author's own horrific experiences. He and fellow POWs had hidden from the raid deep in the bowels of an old abattoir, where they waited it out as all hell rained down from above. Years later, Schlachthof 5 would become the title of perhaps Vonnegut's best-known novel, Slaughterhouse 5. In part, the novel deals with Dresden's destruction and the experience of those who lived through it. At the same time, it incorporates elements of science fiction into a fantastical narrative that spans time periods and galaxies. It's possible that Vonnegut was simply unable to process his experiences at Dresden in any other way. So, what was all this in aid of? Why was Dresden bombed with such merciless ferocity only weeks before Germany's surrender? In truth, there was some military significance to Dresden as a target. There were factories in the area, 127 in total around the city's outskirts, manufacturing things like heavy guns, aircraft components, even poison gas. There were administrative targets too, like the Wehrmacht headquarters, as well as an extensive railway network. In the words of Colonel Harold E. Cook, another American prisoner in Dresden on the night of the raid, "I saw with my own eyes that Dresden was an armed camp. Thousands of German troops, tanks and artillery, and miles of freight cars loaded with supplies, supporting and transporting German logistics towards the east to meet the Russians." But the way in which Dresden was attacked suggests that these were not the priority for the Allies. Planes concentrated their assault on the historic and densely populated city centre, seeking to wreak maximum damage upon the civilian population. For Churchill himself, not usually one to shy away from awesome displays of martial strength, even this was a bit too much. In a memo a month after Dresden, Churchill said, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise, we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land." But let's not forget the ease with which the likes Chief Air Marshal Harris were able to put their scruples to one side. For Harris and others, a population centre was a strategic target, and an effective one too. In Harris's own words, attacks on cities, like any other act of war, are intolerable unless they are strategically justified. But they are strategically justified insofar as they tend to shorten the war and preserve the lives of Allied soldiers. I do not, personally, regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. Following the bombing, Joseph Goebbels tried to use Dresden to gain a propaganda win against the Allies, leading to the commonly held misconception that 200,000 civilians lost their lives to the raid. The true total is likely between 25,000 and 35,000, although this in no way diminishes the horror that thousands of people experienced that night, many of whom would not survive. But by this point in the war, the secrets of the Holocaust had been exposed. Soviet troops had liberated Auschwitz on January 27th, confirming the rumours of mass extermination programs carried out by the Nazis. There would have been little mood for sympathy or restraint from the pilots who flew missions over Germany in the weeks following Auschwitz's liberation, nor from the commanders who sent those missions out. For all of Goebbels' attempts to garner sympathy, Dresden had essentially been left exposed by the Nazis. The mass Revulsion that met the Nazis in the weeks after the exposure of their Holocaust atrocities, coupled with the Allies' proven record of bombing civilian areas, made Dresden a clear target. And the inability of the Luftwaffe to defend the city meant that it was just a matter of time before she was hit. Once again, the crimes of the Nazis have been paid for with the lives of their own people, who died in their thousands on the streets of Dresden as it was consumed in almost biblical fire. But in the aftermath of the war, this unthinkable horror more or less became a footnote to the conflict, drowned out by the jubilation of VE Day and the subsequent anxiety of the Cold War. But in time, perceptions would change. Chief Air Marshal Harris, though loved and respected by his men, became a symbol of bloodthirsty excess. Disgusted with the questioning of his morality, Harris would actually leave the country, spending much of the next decade in South Africa. Despite the questions around his conduct, it wasn't all bad for Harris. He was made a baronet in 1953. For Dresden, the first phases of restoration began in the 1970s, while the city was still under East German control, and this accelerated after the reunification in 1990. Today, Dresden still bears its scars, but much of its historic splendour has been expertly restored. For those who experienced the horror themselves, the long and difficult personal healing process began almost immediately, although this healing could never really be complete. On March 31st, 1945, 6 weeks after the destruction of Dresden, the now 10-year-old Lothar and his mother received a letter. It was from Lothar's older sister. She was actually alive. In the chaotic aftermath of the bombing, Lothar, his mother and his 5-year-old sister were evacuated to a small village near Ustasha. Before leaving the city, they'd scrawled their destination on one of their home's few remaining walls. By a stroke of luck, Lothar's sister had seen it, and in April, they were reunited. As Lothar himself said, he could never forget about what he witnessed on that February night, and his family, like so many others, would never forget the loved ones they'd lost. But this rare note of positivity gave them something to cling to, and just maybe, it helped them survive. It's the summer of 1941. We're just outside a small village named Mededa in modern-day Bosnia-Herzegovina, and a 10-year-old girl named Dobrila Kukul is forced to abandon her chores and run for the hills. Danger is coming to her family in the form of a fledgling new political organisation that has only recently taken power in the region, the Ustasha, led by a man named Ante Pavlich. The crimes of the Ustasha would go on to become so extreme that even their allies in Nazi Germany were shocked by the sheer scale and brutality of the violence. Young Dobrila is about to witness this savagery firsthand. Although she was able to successfully hide from the monsters approaching her farmstead, not everyone was so fortunate. Oftentimes, the Ustasha were unpaid, and so these men in black uniforms tore through the house for anything of value to pillage. Frustrated at the lack of trinkets to loot, they turned their aggression onto the inhabitants of the farmstead. 3 of Dobrila's family fall victim to this violence and are dispatched in a slow, ritualistic manner, as if the Ustasha were savouring the cruelty as they picked apart middle-aged women and elderly men with knives, clubs and bayonets. Dobrila would describe it as a form of butchery. The worst fate came to her neighbour, a man named Sreto, who was captured trying to flee, and since he was a young male, was subjected to torture beyond description. Dobrila and the other survivors are forced to wait in hiding as they hear Sreto's blood-curdling screams ring through the village. Hours pass, and the Ustasha finally leave. Sreto's mother, Anna, rushes to the house to check on her son, and immediately lets out a shriek that is somehow even more disturbing than Sreto's were. She found him in what Dobrila describes as such a state of slaughter that she then passed from farm to farm wailing and begging the other survivors to come to her house and put her son out of his misery. Petrified and traumatized as the other villagers are, though, no one dares to oblige her son with a coup de grace. He passed away from his wounds that night at just 20 years of age. I will leave it for you to imagine the condition that this young man must have been left in for his own mother to decide that death would be a mercy for him, so much so that she would go out and beg her neighbours to perform the grim deed. For the 10-year-old Dobrila, this already horrifying experience is just the beginning, and soon she will find herself centre stage in the cruelty. Of the 12 relatives left standing in her household, only she will survive the violence, going on to give first-hand testimony to prosperity of the cruelty that unfolded not just in this small village of Bosnia, but across all of Yugoslavia. This is the story of the Ustasha. In the 1920s and 30s, in the area known then as Yugoslavia, but which is today Croatia, Serbia and Bosnia, chaos reigned supreme, and political turmoil and division characterized daily life. Through these decades, governments and monarchs would collapse almost as quickly as they took power, due to the region's extremely diverse ethnic groups of Serbs, Croats and Bosniaks, as well as religious divides between Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Jews and Muslims. It was almost impossible for a government to establish a consensus between each of these groups, and the pendulum swung between each group as power changed hands. In the midst of the chaos, a middle-aged Croatian lawyer named Ante Pavelic believed he had the answer to Yugoslavia's woes. A Croatian nation-state within Yugoslavia, free from the influence of Serbs. And so in 1929, he founded the Ustasha, influenced by Italian fascism and later German Nazism. The Ustasha were ultra-nationalist, anti-Serb, anti-communist, fundamentalist Catholics who saw other races and religions as a threat to Croatian identity and the realization of the Croatian state. The means by which to achieve this goal were, predictably, violence. Pavelic would write that knives, revolvers, automatic pistols and time bombs are the bells that ring in the dawn and rebirth of the Croatian state. Despite the fiery words, though, Pavelic would play a relatively minor role in Yugoslavian politics, and during the 1920s and 30s, he even found himself in exile, eyeing the seats of power from the sidelines. Pavelic and the Ustasha would have to wait for their time. But when the Second World War broke out in 1939, they finally got their moment. Chaos on the world stage had shaken up politics within the Balkans, and Yugoslavia was forced to pick a side in the conflict. In March of 1941, Yugoslavia signed the Tripartite Pact with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy and Japan. It looked like Yugoslavia had finally picked a side, and as a fascist himself, Pavelic could not be more pleased about the direction his country was heading in. But then a group of anti-Axis Serbian officers led a coup against the pro-Axis government. Hitler and Mussolini are furious at the loss of a key ally after what they saw as insubordinate meddling. On April 6, 1941, Germany and Italy invaded Yugoslavia, and after just 11 days of fighting, most resistance was firmly squashed. But this put the Axis powers in a bit of a pickle. With the Yugoslavian government now completely collapsing, someone would now need to take the reins of power and ensure that Yugoslavia remained a compliant ally for the war effort. Who better to head this puppet government than the violently nationalistic Ante Pavelic and his fascist party, the Ustasha? By April 10th, Pavelic was firmly in the seat of government as the head of the newly founded independent state of Croatia, and the Ustasha were let loose on the people of Yugoslavia. They would waste no time getting to work, fulfilling their vision of an ethnically pure and religiously united Croatian state. Jews and Roma people were immediately targeted, but those who were the primary object of the Ustasha's hatred were the Serbs, now living within the independent state of Croatia. Ustasha's intentions towards the Serbs has become known as the 3/3 policy. 1/3 to be converted to Catholicism, 1/3 to be expelled from the land, 1/3 to be killed. This was a wildly ambitious task. Of the 6.5 million people living in this new Croatian state, up to 30% were ethnic Serbs, meaning that the Ustasha had around 2 million people to deal with. By their own logic, this meant 700,000 to forcibly convert, 700,000 to deport, and 700,000 to murder. Pavelić and his thugs would have their work cut out for them. And to meet this objective, they set up a number of concentration camps in the opening months of their reign, including Jadovno, Danica, and Slana, as well as Sisak, a concentration camp specifically designed for Serbian children, which we'll cover later. By 1941, due to the relatively chaotic political circumstances and the fact that Pavelić and the Ustasha were new to governance, things were very unstable. And so the Ustasha would use terrifying fear as a tool of governance, making an already brutal ambition that much more bloodthirsty and savage. Although concentration camps had been established, most of the violence during the opening weeks and months would be random, arbitrary, and, quite frankly, sickening. The first of many mass killings would go down on April 30th, 1931, less than 2 weeks after the Ustasha took power, where nearly 200 Serb villagers were rounded up in Gudovac and then dispatched in cold blood. A Catholic bishop named Alojzy Mizic, who was himself Croatian, was horrified at the violence. He described, "People were captured like beasts, slaughtered, killed, thrown live into the abyss. Women, mothers with children, young women, girls and boys were thrown into pits." 6 full train carriages of women, mothers and girls, children under age 10, were taken from Mostar and Saplinya to the Sumachi station, where they were unloaded and taken into the hills, with live mothers and their children tossed down the cliffs. Poor souls. They were calm. I will not enumerate further. I would go too far. Violence was meted out both in large-scale mass atrocities, but also in smaller, more random moments of savage opportunity, in which vulnerable Serbs were targeted on little more than the whim of passing Ustasha members. The historian Jonathan Steinberg tells us about the nature of these crimes. Serbian and Jewish men, women and children were hacked to death. There are photographs of Serbian women with breasts hacked off by pocket knives, men with eyes gouged out, emasculated and mutilated. On top of all this organised violence, there were also groups of unpaid Ustasha volunteers, sometimes called the Wild Ustasha, who would roam the ethnically Serbian countryside looking to chase out Serbs, kill those that remained, and then reimburse themselves for the work by pillaging the houses of their victims and taking away any valuables they could find. It was these so-called Wild Ustasha who came for Dobrila Kukul's family, the 10-year-old girl with whom we opened this episode, and we will now follow her story through the descent into horror. A few days after the first raid, which had taken 3 members of Dobrila's family and left her 20-year-old neighbour Sreto begging to be put out of his misery, the Ustasha would come again for the Kukul family. On this occasion, they were more successful. All of Dobrila's family was captured, where they would slowly be shipped towards Jasenovac concentration camp. Men and women were immediately separated and then made to wait in a neighbouring village. The women in a yard outside of a church, and the men on a meadow on the opposite side. They were told to wait there, since there wasn't currently any capacity for more prisoners in the camp itself. What the Ustasha failed to tell Dobrila was that they were currently making room for her and her family by dispatching those currently inside the overcrowded camp. After 10 days of waiting, the men were loaded up onto trucks and driven off into the distance. Dobrila tells us that was the last time I saw my father, brother, and uncles. A few days later, the women and children would follow suit and were forced to march towards the camp. As she walked through the village on the way to her doom, she remembers a group of Croatians had come out of their houses rattling tin cans and shouting, "Serbs, Serbs, go to the camps. Those are the places you belong to. Go." and end your lives there. Shortly after, Dobrila and the other girls in the family came to the banks of the river Sava, where they would be ferried across into Jasenovac. Whilst on the ferry, her mother, 2 sisters, and Auntie Maria, with 4 of her own children, started to realise the fate in store for them. Dobrila remembers a conversation between her mother Savka and her Auntie Maria. She was telling my mother, "Savka, let us throw our children and ourselves into the river Sava. Come on. You see that they are taking us straight to death." My mother replied, "We won't, Maria. It may happen that some of us stay alive. And here I am, still living and existing." On the entrance to the concentration camp, Dobrila and her family were welcomed with bayonets. Some die right there, only a few feet past the wire that separates the free from the damned. Once Dobrila passes through, however, the horror would only continue, and on one occasion, a cousin of hers, just 11 years old during the ordeal, would find himself the target of violence after he was accused of stealing a piece of black bread. For this transgression, his right hand was cut off at the elbow, in front of her eyes, by the Ustasha. He did not survive the amputation. Dobrila's most harrowing moment was still yet to follow, however, and in a moving interview, she would describe the camp experience and her time there. Entering the concentration camp was the same thing as entering a death club ruled by lawlessness and madness, where you could only hear screams, crying and moaning all the way to the sky. One sight that still freezes the blood in my veins is running from the Ustasha, who were capturing little girls and then brutalizing them. That's when I accidentally stepped on a newborn lying on the ground. The cry it let out still rings in my ears. All of this unimaginable horror for a girl who was only 10 years old, now separated from her family and completely alone, and to an extent, you could argue she was one of the lucky ones, in that she was able to actually survive the madness and live on to tell her story. But she writes, "The consequences of that horror and evil left a deep trace of sorrow, misery, and grief on my soul, because I lost the dearest people in my life. I had a joyful and happy childhood before the evil occurred." And it wasn't just at Jasenovac that these atrocities were taking place. Around the same time that Dobrila was in captivity, other horrors were taking place in another camp named Yadovno, where it was reported that cases of flaying were popping up. Flaying, if you didn't know, is the removal of the entirety of your skin whilst you're still alive. It's an unthinkably cruel process which requires precision and intent to perform. One Serbian priest named Damjan Štrbac was reportedly subjected to this fate before his skinless body was tossed into a ditch to expire. All of this is, of course, horrific, and it wasn't just the immediate victims that this horror left an impression on. Many Nazi soldiers and officers found themselves working in and around the region at the time, and despite the atrocities that the Nazis were performing back in Germany and Poland, what they were seeing in Croatia seemed a step too far, even for them. The German Captain Konopatski called the slaughter of Serbs in eastern Bosnia a new wave of butchery of innocents. Lieutenant Colonel von Wedel would describe the entire affair as bestial, and in the end, General von Holstenau would send a letter right back to Germany about the humanitarian concerns in the region. About 500 15 to 20-year-old thugs descended under the leadership of an Ustasha lieutenant colonel. People were killed everywhere. Women were assaulted and then tortured to death. Children were killed. I saw in the Sava River the corpse of a young woman with her eyes dug out and a stake driven into her parts. This woman was at most 20 years old when she fell into the hands of these monsters. All around, pigs devoured unburied human beings. By 1942, Germany was concerned that this might be creating an image problem for the Axis powers, and that the scale of violence might lead to further uprisings. As a result, they took the extraordinary step of putting an Ustasha chaplain named Miroslave Filipovic on trial for the massacre of 2,300 civilians across 3 villages. It's worth remembering that this was probably out of a practical necessity to keep things stable and orderly, rather than any ethical reservations about what the Ustasha were up to. Either way, though, it created a bit of a rift between Germany and Croatia, and when a German general remarked that the Ustasha had killed 500,000 Serbs in this horrific way, an Ustasha official replied, "500,000 is a slanderous accusation. The number is not higher than 200,000. It seems that from an ethical lens, both sides seem to have completely missed the point. Disagreements aside, though, not much would change, and for the next 4 years or so, Pavelić and the Ustasha would have full reign to persecute any they deemed as unworthy or undesirable. Numbers are disputed, but as many as 500,000 perished in the fires of ethnic division and fascist extremism. All of this would finally come to a close in 1945, when the Second World War was finally being wrestled to its grand conclusion. Without Germany and Italy's financial and military support, the Ustasha began to fall apart, although it was during these final months and weeks that the violence peaked, as fanatics took on an almost apocalyptic attitude towards the changing winds. Nonetheless, with the Ustasha and Pavelić weak in the absence of his allies, a communist partisan named Josip Broz Tito was able to sweep into the capital of Zagreb in May 1945. The Ustasha collapsed, and Pavelić fled to Austria, then Italy, then France, and finally Argentina. Although he never actually faced a trial for his participation in the genocide, he was eventually shot in Argentina by a Yugoslavian agent. He survived the shooting at first, but 2 years later died from his wounds. Although Pavelić never faced formal justice for his crimes, many of the Ustasha would, in what became known as the Bleiburg reparations. Back in May 1945, when many Ustasha members were fleeing Zagreb, they were intercepted by the British armed forces, who in turn handed them back over to Joseph Tito and his partisan forces. What followed was a series of war crime trials, but also mass executions, some against guilty members of the Ustasha, but many also against civilian women and children who were swept up in the exodus and feared an indiscriminate series of reprisals against the Croats for what the Ustasha had done to the Serbs. After successfully stamping out the Ustasha, Tito would go on to wipe out the project for a Croatian state and establish a communist dictatorship in Yugoslavia. His promise was one of brotherhood and unity, meaning there was a strict ban on nationalism of any kind. Under Tito, speaking of any ethnic grievances in the region was a dangerous offence, causing many to hold their tongue. This forced silence would build into long-term pressure, which would eventually explode onto the world stage in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. Many of the tensions and causes of which can be traced right back to 1941, with Ante Pavelić and Ustasha. It's November 1941. We're in Leningrad. This great Russian city has been known by many names: St. Petersburg, Petrograd, but now it's named after the architect of the 1917 revolution, Vladimir Lenin. Much like its namesake, the city itself is in a bad way. Almost completely cut off since September, food rations are now all but exhausted. The city is starving. Let it starve, Hitler says. To use his own words, we have no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. For the 2.5 million citizens trapped within, the whole affair is nothing short of hell. They patiently queue up to hours for bread rations each day, 4 ounces of the stuff per person, and as time passes, it becomes bread in name only, fattened with glue and sawdust. Then, even that begins to dry up. The people consume what they can to stay alive: cats, dogs, pigeons, leather belts, the soles of boots. Those with money sicken and die alongside those without. Who needs rubles when there's nothing to buy? 5-year-old Yevgenia Boyanova hurries through the bombed-out streets, clutching the hand of her elder sister, Maya. They are headed for the market to trade their meagre possessions for whatever scraps of food may be left. But even this trip is fraught with danger. The hunger is driving people mad, so the rumours go. Folks are being murdered for ration cards, lives snuffed out for a few more ounces of rancid bread a day. But Yevgenia has not lost the innocence of childhood. For her, there is still wonder to be found in this place, populated by the dead and the half-living. A distant rumble in the frigid sky, and Yevgenia raises her eyes towards it. A plane, soaring high above the forsaken city. Her hand slips from Maya's grip, and she stares with wonder at the machine, only vaguely aware of what it is. A woman approaches her, breaking the distraction. "Little one," she says, "wouldn't you like some candy?" Yevgenia would love some candy, the faint memory of its sweetness flooding back to her. She nods eagerly, and the woman grabs her roughly by the hand. With this, a scream rips through the air. It's Maya, running towards her, waving her arms desperately. The woman's hand recedes, and she melts away into the crowd. Maya pulls her sister close, holds her tight. This is what it's come to. In a city with nothing left, human beings are being snatched off the street, imprisoned, slaughtered for meat, and lone 5-year-olds like Yevgenia are the easiest target. The siege is barely 2 months old. It will be more than 2 years until it's finally broken, when the Red Army begins driving the Axis forces back westwards on the long road to Berlin. The nightmare is just beginning, and before it's over, more than 1 million people will lie dead. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad. On June 22nd, 1941, the flimsy non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviets evaporated. 3 million German troops poured over the border with 3,000 tanks and 2,500 planes. 30 divisions of Finnish and Romanian troops joined them. It was the largest invasion force in human history, its full force bearing down on the USSR. By September, Axis forces were approaching Leningrad. The German advance from the south was matched by a Finnish advance from the north, and when the fortress at Schlüsselburg fell on September 15th, the city was basically surrounded. The advance halted, and then the Luftwaffe took over. On the 19th, German planes hammered the city. 1,000 died that day alone, the raid striking homes and hospitals indiscriminately. Many of the dead were wounded soldiers, back from the front, defenceless in their hospital beds as German bombs crashed down on top of them. Leningrad's population braced for a final assault, but it never came. With 200,000 Soviet troops still within the city, the German Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, was reluctant to push into Leningrad. The Finns weren't interested in bloody, drawn-out urban warfare either. They'd retaken the territory lost during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and so on September 7th, they stopped their advance at the fortified Karelian region. To quote the historian Jesse Alexander, the Finns were a little bit cautious. They didn't want to go all out. They hedged their bets, which turned out in the future to be a very, very good idea for them. So the Germans set about playing the long game, squeezing the life out of the city caught between the Baltic Sea to the west and Lake Ladoga to the east. This lake became key to Leningrad's survival, covering more than 17,000 square kilometres. Ladoga was a barrier, preventing total Axis control of the city's eastern flank. But it was also a lifeline, Leningrad's only connection with the Red Army at the Volkhov front, and to the rest of the Soviet Union beyond. A huge Soviet flotilla began ferrying supplies across the water, but the German Air Force wasn't going to sit back and just let this happen. Planes roared overhead, seeking to shatter the convoys with bullet and bomb. On the coastline around Schlüsselburg, artillery kept up a near-constant barrage. But let's not forget just what Germany was dealing with here. They might have had the largest invasion force in history, but they were fighting on numerous fronts across a vast landmass. With the Germans stretched thin, the Soviets had the slimmest of chances, and thanks to the bravery and tenacity of those flotilla crews, supplies were getting through. The German High Command rethought its position. What if, rather than swatting at flies out on the lake, they could cut off the supply lines altogether? If they could sever that artery, they could bleed Leningrad dry. And so that's exactly what they did. A bold push eastwards drove deep into the Russian lines southeast of the lake, and German forces took the town of Tikhvin on November the 9th. Without Tikhvin, the Soviets had no highway. No highway meant no way to traverse the dense forests and swampy terrain of northeastern Russia. Now Leningrad was truly alone, and starvation began. Entire families struggled against the incessant, gnawing hunger. Many succumbed. An 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savitcheva recorded the demise of her own family in heartbreakingly stark terms. Zhenya died on December 28th. Grandma died on January 25th. Leica died on March 5th at 5 in the morning. The Savitchevs are dead. Everyone is dead. I am all alone. Tanya would eventually escape Leningrad, but would not live to see the end of the war. She died on July 1st, 1944, of intestinal tuberculosis. She was only 14 years old. The city she left behind plunged into despair. In the words of historian Anna Reid, Leningraders resorted to their most desperate food substitutes, scraping dried glue from the underside of wallpaper and boiling up shoes and belts. Some went to even more extreme lengths. Devastating stories of cannibalism emerged from the city. A mother who murdered her toddler to feed her 3 children. A husband who killed his wife to keep his sons and nieces alive. Around 1,500 Leningraders were arrested on suspicion of cannibalism. Some were executed on the spot. A survivor named Alexander Sasha Mikhailovich recalled, "A woman approached me. She promised me bread, sweets, and other treats. I believed her. I was hungry. My auntie saw me dragged into the woman's flat and called a policeman. The woman was arrested, her flat searched, and they found human remains, some half-eaten. She was taken outside and shot." Even those who did not resort to cannibalism were driven close to madness. Natalia Uskova remembered lying in bed listening to the radio and suddenly feeling like her head was expanding, as if it would burst on her shoulders. She desperately wrote in her diary, "Am I losing my mind?" Others approached the futility of their situation with pitch-black humour. Dmitry Lazarev was cheered to hear his daughter and niece singing "Mary Had a Little Lamb" together, but listening closer, he learned what the girls were really singing. It doesn't rhyme particularly well when translated from Russian to English, but the words are understandably chilling. "And for supper, clearly, I'll need a little baby. I will take the neighbour's, steal him from his cradle." Even a city as resilient as Leningrad could not go on like this. Supply convoys had to start flowing again, which meant Tikhvin must be retaken. But even if it could be, winter was coming. Winter meant a lake choked with ice, and no ships. In the settlement of Kobona, Lake Lagoda narrows, around 30 kilometers, dividing this Soviet-held village from Leningrad on the western shore. In the early morning hours of November 17th, 1941, a team of hydrographers and scouts inches its way out onto the ice. So early in the winter, the ice itself is treacherously thin. Each step could mean plummeting into the lake below or being spotted by a Luftwaffe patrol and destroyed. Nonetheless, they must push on. Lieutenant General Zakhar Kondratiev watches their progress nervously. Danger lurked at every step. The ice was cracking menacingly. At the 5th or 6th kilometre from the shore, the wind increased to a gale. The ice became thinner, sagged more noticeably, and the first cracks appeared. They strapped themselves with ropes. Everyone kept a close eye on his comrade, ready to rush to the rescue immediately. Progress is agonizingly slow. Then disaster. They're spotted. Enemy artillery opens up, tearing great holes in the ice. But the men keep on, shivering, freezing, terrified, shells bursting around them. the frozen mass of the lake heaving beneath their feet. A day later, by some miracle, they are on the opposite bank at Vaganova, finally within the perimeter of the encircled Leningrad. It can be done. The frozen lake can be crossed. Supplies begin moving across the ice almost immediately. Military Road number 101, the Road of Life, is the only thing keeping Leningrad alive. But it's just keeping the city on life support. To revitalize this urban siege, Tivkin must fall. As December bit down hard, the Germans at Tivkin were struggling to hold on. Decimated by Soviet fire and brutal winter conditions, their situation was dire. Von Lieb immediately understood what needed to be done. They must withdraw from Tivkin or face utter annihilation. Hitler was furious, but reluctantly agreed, and so the Germans pulled out on December the 8th, leaving a reported 7,000 dead behind them. Tivkin was back in Soviet hands, and the Road of Life was open for business. Throughout the winter, goods flowed into Leningrad, but this journey was still a perilous one. The vehicles caused what the Soviets called resonance oscillations, which split previously reliable areas of ice. After losing several trucks to the deathly waters of the lake, strict speed limits were introduced. The lake and its surrounding area became a sophisticated network of transport and logistics, with road signs, bridges, repair workshops, and medical aid stations. At its height, some 1,779 kilometers of road crisscrossed the area. Managing all this were the White Angels, a group of mainly female personnel who stood out on the route with flashlights and guided the trucks. Unfortunately, their lights guided German planes too. Many of the White Angels were blown to pieces, or left to drown after falling through ice, shattered by Luftwaffe pilots desperately trying to stop the trucks. But they stuck with their task, and by December 23rd, 800 tons of supplies were rolling across the lake each day. But this still wasn't enough to keep the city fed. By the new year, bread rations had fallen to 3.5 ounces per day for engineers and factory workers, and for the rest, it was 2.5 ounces, basically a single slice of bread for 24 hours. So the Soviets stepped up their work. Each driver was given the target of 2 crossings a day. 261 hit this target in January 1942, reaching 627 in March. But then spring brought faint glimmers of hope to Leningrad. With the warm weather, citizens could grow vegetables. The kitchen gardens flourished across the city. This wasn't so much dig for victory as it was dig for survival. Spring became summer and the famine eased. Life was almost tolerable in Leningrad. But could she survive another winter? No one wanted to take that chance. The Red Army would have to break the siege. Leningrad could not hold out forever. But then, on a pleasant summer's evening on August 9th, 1942, the white columns of the Philharmonic Society Hall are decked out with lights, and beneath them, filling the space to the brim, legions of Leningraders sit in eager anticipation. Teachers and soldiers sit side by side with party functionaries and factory workers, all here to witness a special event. A performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, simply entitled Leningrad. Conductor Karl Eliasberg, half-starved, stands high upon his rostrum, his fine suit baggy against his emaciated frame. Only 14 musicians remain in the city's once great orchestra, and so its ranks are swelled by anyone who can play. There are fire watchers, soldiers, munitions workers. Some still wear the uniform of battle. All bear the scars of 11 months under siege. But it's a performance for the whole city. Loudspeakers carry its notes throughout the great, stricken metropolis. Some speakers are turned towards the enemy lines. A mischievous act of defiance. The voice of Shostakovich himself drifts across the airwaves. I assure you, comrades, in the name of all Leningraders, that we are invincible and that we are ever at our posts. This was the day that Hitler had hoped to hold his own banquet celebrating the fall of the city, but the message was clear. There would be no Nazi celebration in Leningrad. The city was still here, and here she would stay. But as August faded and temperatures began to fall once again, thoughts turned to another winter. In fact, both sides feared the onset of the season. The Soviets, terrified that another famine would destroy them, regrouped for a final assault. The Nazis, aware of their dwindling momentum, sought to wipe Leningrad out once and for all. For the Germans, Operation Nordlicht, Northern Light, was designed to be the final word in the siege. The lengthy, costly attempt to squeeze the life from Leningrad had been only partially successful, and so now they would smash the city and burn it to the ground. But the German-held land south of Lake Ladoga was only 16 kilometers wide in places. The Red Army was tantalizingly close to breaking the siege, and that January they already tried. A combined assault from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts had ended in disaster, resulting in the almost total annihilation of the Second Shock Army. But the Soviets were eager to try again before winter returned, and so on August 19th, 4 days before the planned beginning of Nordlicht, the Russians got the jump on their enemy and launched the Sinyavino offensive. 190,000 men, including a revived Second Shock Army, attacked across the Schisselberg salient. By late September, they were almost halfway across, but were dangerously overstretched. The Nazis sensed this, and they attacked, where they were able to cut off and surround the advanced troops. For the second time that year, the Second Shock Army was isolated behind enemy lines. Casualties were horrendous, and the Soviet offensive was truly repulsed. It was a disaster for the Red Army, but it was somehow worse for the Nazis. Nordlicht was shelved, and the Germans would never again mount an assault on Leningrad. And then, on one freezing night on January 18th, 1943, with spring still far away, something strange started happening. Across the city, windows, usually shut tight against the bitter chill, were flung wide. Curtains flapped in the breeze, and gramophone music wafted down the street. There were cheers, sounds of joy, an emotion so nearly forgotten in the dark winter of 1941-42. Leningrad radio had also made an announcement. "The ring has been burst open. We have long waited for this day, but we knew it must come." Hours earlier, to the southeast, troops from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts embraced for the first time in years, as the lead elements of both forces linked up across the Schisselberg salient. An unbroken line now connected Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. But for all the music and celebration, this had been yet another costly mission. 6 days earlier, on January 12th, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, Spark, led by the famous general Georgy Zhukov. Facing them, on the German side, was a new and horrifying weapon, the Tiger tank. These monsters could knock out Soviet T-34s with one shot, burning Russian tanker crews alive in their vehicles. But the boggy terrain made tank warfare difficult, and on the other side of Schisselberg's only north-south road, Tigers floundered in the mire, their crews sitting ducks for the anti-tank squads roaming the country. Towards the end of the battle, the petrol-soaked bog was set alight, transforming the landscape into something truly diabolical. The Soviet soldier Nikolai Vasipov remembers, "The trees were smashed, and the air was thick with burning peat. It was an inferno, and I found it hard to ignore the cries of the wounded echoing through the smoke and the trees. It was hell on earth." Against this horrific backdrop, the fortress town of Schisselberg was taken. But now another problem emerged. What to do about its population? Numbering 15,000 at the beginning of the war, most had been starved, extradited to Germany, or simply executed. Now only a few hundred remained. Surely these survivors were true heroes of the great patriotic war, hardy souls who had endured the worst of Nazi occupation. Well, not in the eyes of the notorious NKVD secret police. Nikolai Vasipov remembered some residents were none too pleased about their so-called liberation, and instead were wishing to remain living under German control. The NKVD offered another solution, that they need not remain living at all. In Vasipov's account, the survivors were rounded up and marched into Leningrad, where they were shot dead. The Soviets suffered 115,000 casualties taking Schisselberg, In contrast, the Germans had suffered just 12,000 dead, and the hole punched through their salient was rather narrow, only 10 kilometres wide. But so far from home, the Nazis couldn't reinforce, nor could they retake the Schisselberg corridor. For Leningrad, the nightmare was so nearly over, as long as the Red Army could drive home their advantage. Perhaps all that gramophone music was a little premature. The siege was far from lifted. German troops still occupied the area south of Leningrad, while the Finns held their lines to the north. Aware they were losing a grip on the city, German troops stepped up their artillery bombardments, hammering Leningrad more out of spite than strategy. Citizens who had survived this grim hell for nearly 2 years were now being cut down and killed by shells almost pointlessly. Meanwhile, Soviet troops struggled to repeat the success of Iskra. At Krasny Bor in February, 44,000 Soviet soldiers were defeated by just nearly 6,000 of the Blue Division of Spanish volunteers. That same month, Operation Polar Star sought to destroy Army Group North, but this too had fizzled out by April. There was some good news for the Russians though. Having hedged their bets in 1941, the Finns in the north were about to reap the rewards of their caution. It was becoming pretty clear that Helsinki was on the wrong side of the war. Allied victories at Stalingrad, Sicily and Kursk in 1943 had made this painfully clear, and now they wanted out of their alliance with Germany. So with no fighting on the northern front, the Germans to the south were basically isolated. On January 14, 1944, the Red Army launched the massive Leningrad-Novgorod assault on 3 fronts, aimed at destroying Army Group North and lifting the siege at Leningrad for good. It took 2 weeks for Russian troops to push just 100 kilometers south. But on January 26th, the Moscow-Leningrad Railway was declared open once again, and Stalin proclaimed the siege of Leningrad officially lifted. But there's a common theme running right through the story of the Soviets on the Eastern Front, the theme of colossal victories that seem an awful lot like bitter defeats. At Kursk, the Red Army held off a vicious German counterattack, but suffered an estimated 800,000 casualties in the process. In the chaos of Stalingrad, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers perished, with 40,000 civilians dead. We can add Leningrad to this list. It's difficult to know precisely how many died in what historian Victor Davis Hansen calls civilization's most lethal siege. Some estimates put the total as high as 1.5 million. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's civilian population also lost their lives. Leningrad had not only been shattered, it had been humiliated. The great city on the Baltic had the soul ripped from it, its dignity stripped away, its citizens reduced to eating human flesh, even their own family members, just to stay alive. But in the years that followed, Leningrad became a city of survivors. Among those survivors was Sasha Mikhailov, the young boy who narrowly escaped being a victim of cannibalism during the siege. Sasha lived to become a beloved grandparent and recorded his experience shortly before his death in 2018. Another survivor was Yevgenia Buyanova, the youngster whose own harrowing story began our video. Yevgenia went on to go to school, get married, and then had a son in the city of Leningrad, before eventually emigrating to the United States in the 1980s. Both Yevgenia and Sasha remembered the bleakest points of the siege, but also the shreds of positivity they found around them. Yevgenia remembered her mother saving their neighbour by sharing their bread allotment. She said, "We survived by having compassion." Sasha recalled how a stranger gave him and his starving brother bread, despite surely being close to death himself. In Sasha's own words, bread in those days was like gold. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, hope and humanity remain. And few chapters are darker than that which unfolded in Leningrad, where civilian and soldier alike endured nearly 900 days of horror. It's the 16th of October 1944. We're in modern-day Taiwan. An aerial battle tears across the sky. Japan and the USA have been entrenched in a brutal slugging match over the Pacific since the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Although it was expected to be a quick win for the Japanese, Pearl Harbor didn't quite deliver the knockout blow they were after. Instead, the past 3 years have been host to the largest ever naval campaign in human history, and it hasn't gone well for Japan. Things are starting to crumble. But one man, Rear Admiral Arima Masafumi, a pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy, is determined to turn the tide. As he marches to his aircraft, he turns back to his comrades, tears off his rank and insignia, and declares proudly that this will be his last flight. He has no intention of coming back alive. He boards, takes off, and scans the sea for his target. He finds the USS Franklin, an American aircraft carrier. It's a fine target, but Arima Masafumi won't risk being shot down on a simple bombing run. He wants results. He drops into a nosedive, aiming straight at the deck of the USS Franklin. For the Americans aboard, the sight is almost unbelievable. 10,000 kilograms of steel and explosives are now hurtling towards the ship at 500 miles per hour. A direct hit is all but certain. Masafumi isn't piloting a plane anymore. It's now essentially a rocket, guided by human hands until the last moment. It's the first ever kamikaze attack, and the damage is staggering. The USS Franklin is out of action, so is Masafumi, but for his heroic sacrifice and courage, Masafumi is posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Well, that's the story, anyway. The reality is that Masafumi's kamikaze attack was a bit of a failure. He did make contact with the ship, but the damage was mostly superficial. The USS Franklin was very much still in the fight. There's also some speculation about whether or not this was even the first kamikaze attack, with some saying the very first may have actually been a damaged American bomber, making the most out of the death sentence as they fell from the sky. For the desperate Imperial Japanese command, however, the facts come second place. This technique, kamikaze, could be the tactic that allows Japan to snatch a victory from the brink of collapse. The 49-year-old man, Arima Masafumi, couldn't have possibly known this, but his final act on Earth would set an example that mere boys, sometimes just 17 years old, will be forced to follow. 2,600 boys, in fact, 2/3 of which were under the age of 18. What many don't know is that there's also an entire underwater kamikaze campaign, which is somehow even more depressing than the airborne tactics. But why? Why was Japan so desperate that they'd throw the cream of their youth at American ships, along with the few airplanes they had left in service? To answer that, we need to zoom out a little. Around 2 years before all of this, in June of 1942, the Japanese and US navies stood off at the Battle of Midway. It was a crushing defeat for Japan, losing the majority of their naval power in less than a week. More crippling than their naval losses, though, was the human toll. Imperial Japan doesn't flinch at the loss of a few thousand men. In fact, they routinely treat life with pitifully low value. And it's this disregard for human life that will come back to bite them. At Midway, the majority of their best pilots were shot down out of the sky, and they were simply left to drown in the Pacific Ocean. Of course, an army is only as good as its soldiers, and when you throw away your best, you have to toss your rookies on the front line. 2 years later, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan did just that. To meet the American Air Force, 373 Japanese aircraft were sent into the sky. 243 of these rookie pilots were shot down in just 3 hours. The single greatest loss of naval air power in all history, and it happened in less than a day. The Americans will later call this battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because of how easy it was to drag these green pilots out of the sky. After that, any hopes of going toe-to-toe with the American pilots was dashed. And now Japan has material pressures to consider as America et al. Rolls up the Japanese empire like an old carpet. With the loss of territory comes the loss of essential resources. The British reoccupation of Burma strangles their timber supply. Once French Indochina is gone, so is the rubber, and the oil starts to run dry once Sumatra and Borneo change hands. Luckily, Imperial Japan has an enormous backup stock of planes, some in better nick than others, but serviceable nonetheless. But the strangled supply of fuel and the fact that all their pilots are rookies creates a problem. They can't be properly trained. They simply don't have the oil to burn on practice flights, bombing run drills and dogfighting tactics. Practice flying hours before deployment had already been cut to a measly 100 hours, hence the humiliating slaughter that took place over the skies of the Philippine Sea. It turns out effective piloting is quite the skill, and the resources required to train new airmen are considerable even at the best of times. It also doesn't help things that revolutions in American radar technology add an extra layer of complexity to any potential air operation. But kamikaze, literally translated as divine wind, the process of turning a plane into a human-guided missile, suddenly seemed like the answer to Japan's problems. The training for this horrifying tactic is simple. You're not training fighter pilots or precision bombers. You just pack a plane full of explosives and train the new pilot to nosedive into American naval assets. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi immediately saw the potential, famously declaring, "If I had 300 planes, I could change the course of the war." And he's not entirely wrong either. Knock out those battleships and air carriers, and the US is left toothless in the Pacific. And that's even if they still feel like fighting after they witness the warrior spirit of Japan slam into their sailors, one suicidal flight mission at a time. But it's all well and good dreaming about a sky full of fanatical death pilots willing to plunge headfirst into certain death just for a shot at giving the Americans a bloody nose. The reality, however, is that finding volunteers for this new suicide squad would be quite the challenge. But Imperial Japan has a winning propaganda move up their sleeve. Just days after the posthumous promotion of Vice Admiral Arima Masafumi, the so-called first kamikaze pilot, Japanese High Command pull in another ace pilot, Yukio Seki, and they ask him to follow the example of the great but now dead patriot Masafumi. Young Yukio, just 23 years old, is beside himself at such a request. Why would Japan waste one of their best pilots like this? But his protest is quickly explained away. Lieutenant Yukio Seki is basically a household name in Japan. Fighter pilots are the rock stars of 20th century warfare. If he would take part in a kamikaze mission, then Japan would have no problems finding more volunteers eager to sign up and follow in the footsteps of the great Yukio Seki. Although he is asked to volunteer, Yukio knows this is an order. Refusal isn't an option. With a deep sigh, he agrees. But he won't give the Japanese High Command the media sensation they're looking for. On October 25th, 1944, while boarding his plane, Yukio is stopped by a journalist for some inspiring final words. He says flatly and plainly, "I'm not going on this mission for the Emperor or the country. I'm going because I was ordered to." With that, he unceremoniously takes off and slams himself into the USS St. Lo, an escort carrier. Yukio's skill as a fighter pilot proves devastatingly effective. At 10:50 AM, he managed to slam into the flight deck, allowing his explosive payload to crash through the deck and down into the hangar, where American aircraft were being refueled. A gasoline fire erupted within the ship, eventually reaching the weapons bay. The entirety of USS St. Lo's torpedo and bomb magazine was detonated, resulting in an enormous explosion which sent debris flying in all directions. Yukio Seki couldn't have been more effective. A lone fighter plane in one strike sinks the 10,000-ton ship, killing 143 of the 900 or so men on board. The young fighter ace may have refused to pay lip service to this deranged tactic, but the effectiveness speaks for itself. Thanks to his sacrifice, Japanese command now has a proof of concept and another fabulous propaganda win. Now the question remains, who should be next in line to take on this great patriotic honour? What kind of person would be the best candidate for Japan to throw at the American Navy? The young Yukio had actually been one of around 20 pilots that were volunteered for the first premeditated kamikaze attacks, but Japan quickly realised that sending their best and brightest pilots on one-way missions was a recipe for disaster. As fate would have it though, there was a perfect pool of candidates ready to man these new kamikaze squads, now called tokutai, or special attack units. You see, at this time, Japan had an entire portion of men that had been excused from fighting in the war. Those who had shown great academic promise were spared the front lines in order to pursue their studies. These men were supposed to be Japan's next generation of administrators, politicians, bureaucrats and doctors. But the war consumes everything. They'll have to put their studies on hold permanently. The emperor needs them. One other thing to bear in mind is that these men, who had been shielded from the war so far, were in reality just boys. The average age of these new recruits is about 17, dragged out of college so that they can be trained to die. This photo shows one such recruit, Yukio Araki, just 17 years old, as he holds a puppy. Within 24 hours of this photograph being taken, he'll die. In fact, none of the child kamikaze pilots in this photo would survive the war. They would all be commanded to die for the emperor before ever tasting adulthood. But it's not all smooth sailing for the Japanese command. At first, they thought the schoolboys would be loyal servants willing to die for their emperor, and they thought this for good reason. Japan had been embarking on a project to brainwash its entire culture into a militaristic society since at least the 1930s, even putting Bushido, a warped version of the samurai warrior code of ethics, into mainstream schooling. These boys would have had their entire educational experience underpinned by these military values, taught practically from birth, that to fight and die for the emperor was the highest honour one could live for, and, for all intents and purposes, they'd lived a charmed life up until this point. Surely they, the chief beneficiaries of this new world, would be the most ideologically ready to take on this enormous responsibility. As it turns out, the boys were less keen to die than originally expected. They'd have to drag the young boys into their planes, kicking and screaming, sometimes quite literally. One boy even goes so far as to strafe one of his officers on the way out. So, yes, the practical training might have been easy enough, but there's some work to do on installing that kamikaze spirit. The training program would need a few changes. So, instead of telling the boys they were being volunteered for kamikaze missions before they started their training, this time they do things the other way round. First, they call the boys in for regular military training, and then once they were sufficiently brainwashed, they'd hit them with the grand reveal. One such lucky recruit was Irokawa Dakaichi, like many others, a student dragged away from his college in Tokyo to perform military duty aged just 19. He began his training at Tsutsura Naval Base, one of around 10 camps where the boys would be trained to slam headfirst into the Americans, who were now crawling ever closer to Japan itself. The first thing he learns is how to end his life, either by inserting his bayonet into his stomach or by placing a rifle under his chin and using his big toe to pull the trigger. He would also see death firsthand. Anyone guilty of serious disobedience would be shot dead almost on the spot. They were immediately taught to adopt a fatalistic approach. Death was inevitable to a Japanese soldier. It's how you die that matters. A crucial lesson for a soon-to-be suicide bomber, even if he doesn't know it yet. It doesn't help that the gnarled veterans in charge of the training absolutely despise these pampered, effeminate bookworms. They're a far cry from the warrior ideal, but they're soon hardened to the reality of war and military life. Their comforts are immediately snatched away, replaced instead with sleeping rough and eating an appalling diet, mainly consisting of a watery porridge made from rice or barley. But measly food isn't the only thing on the menu for these young recruits. Beatings are a common feature too. On one occasion, Irokawa and his comrades are accused of leaving camp to go and eat at a local farmer's house, a kindly old man who often takes pity on the hungry recruits. It's a disgraceful transgression. Dakaichi is beaten so badly that he can't even recognise his own face. It turns out he doesn't even know who this farmer was. He writes in his memoir that he wouldn't have dared to go to eat there, even if he had been invited. And besides, the naval base was serving white rice that evening, an unbelievable luxury for a soldier in late war Japan. However, the mere accusation of having left camp is enough for his superiors to beat him savagely. The only thing he has for sustenance that night is a mouthful of his own blood. It's a heartbreakingly typical camp experience for these boys, some just 17. But it all serves a purpose. The collective trauma they experience fosters something called esprit de corps, a camaraderie and loyalty between each of them that will stand up to anything. Now they've been through everything together, they'll do anything for each other. It's quite literally a form of brainwashing, and now these young boys have nothing to lose, no perceived fear of death, and a total dependence on each other. It's time to drop the punchline. They're shifted into a lecture room, sometimes hundreds at a time, and informed that they're about to be the luckiest soldiers in all of Japan. These young kids have the opportunity to become kamikaze pilots and die for the emperor so that they can send the Americans packing. The entire group is volunteered by default, but if anybody feels like they're not up to the task, then all they need to do is stand up and walk to the front of the room, in front of those same comrades they've bled next to and depended on for safety, all the way up until this point. No one wants to be seen as a coward or a traitor to their comrades and friends. Peer pressure, reinforced by weeks of shared trauma, ensures the predictably grim response. Virtually every volunteer accepts their task, and those who refuse are made examples of. By a twist of fortune, Takeichi manages to survive. The war comes to a close before his kamikaze unit is ever called for the final act. He lived until 2021, eventually becoming a historian in his post-war life. Others aren't so lucky. Toshio Anazawa, 23, is forced to throw his life away on the 12th of April 1945, just 5 months before the end of the war. He's also a Christian, a faith which forbids suicide as an unthinkable sin. To hedge his bets, he writes home to his mother, "I entrust you to the Lord's hands. Please pray for me. If I am reborn, I want to be a Christian. I believe that when I join the Lord in heaven, we will meet again." He also writes a list of desires, things he wished he could have seen, read, or heard before the end of his life. The final item on his list is simply the voices of fondly remembered people. It's the last 6 words he'll ever write, but it's not the first time he's had to fashion his last letter. Throughout those last months, he's told at least 4 times that it's his time to fly a kamikaze mission. But be it due to bad weather, mechanical faults, or a simple change of plans, the mission ends up aborted. One can only imagine the frayed nerves, the psychological toll of having your death put on hold, only for the dreaded order to resurface a few days later. It's actually quite a common misconception that kamikaze pilots were forced to go through with their mission no matter what. The reality is that these pilots had the freedom to return at any point, if it was for good reason. Poor visibility, a lack of valuable targets, or technical failure were perfectly acceptable reasons to return to base and try again next time. See, by this point in the war, Japan has few precious resources remaining. These kamikaze pilots and their planes are valuable. Throwing them at anything other than a knockout blow would be an utter waste. But while the pilots in the sky are able to return to land if the mission is hopeless, there's a whole side to the kamikaze that's happening underwater, and there's no backup plan for those poor souls. It turns out that the Japanese submariners are inspired by the tactic of airborne kamikaze attacks. The subsurface fleet is facing the same issues that the Air Force is, and need to find a new way to strike at American ships with increasingly scarce resources. They engineer their own underwater version of a kamikaze attack, a kaiten. It's quite literally just a modified torpedo with a seat for a pilot and a rudimentary control system. When a solid American target presented itself, the pilot would crawl into the torpedo while the naval engineers weld the opening shut, permanently sealing the poor soul inside. Then, this human-guided missile would be launched from the submarine and travel underwater till it struck its target. It's a miserable failure. The improvised welding doesn't stand up to the pressure underwater and often begins to leak, leaving the soldier to drown before he has a chance to strike a ship. Some simply miss the target or fail altogether as the modifications interfere with the torpedoes, which are already unpredictable and prone to failure at the best of times. Most of those piloting Kaiten either drown in their torpedoes or simply sink to the bottom of the ocean and suffocate inside, having achieved essentially nothing. Hundreds of sailors perish in these underwater coffins. But unlike the Kaiten torpedoes, the airborne kamikaze attacks are relatively effective. Although only 14% of kamikaze pilots are able to successfully dive into their targets, some 300 ships are sunk or damaged, and 10,000 Allied sailors are killed or injured by the attacks. It's a devastating tactic, at least at first. Towards the end of the war, the Americans begin to find ways to counter this new threat. There's even a new squadron formed to deal with the pilots before they get too close, the kamikaze hunters. In the end though, even if the tactic remained effective, Japan's strategic mind had already scattered her hopes of a grand Pacific empire. American ships could be repaired in weeks and back on the ocean again. There was no turning back this tide. The most consequential feature of the kamikaze attacks is the psychological toll that it took on the Americans. It was a huge knock for already struggling morale. Americans were unable to imagine how they could ever overcome an enemy who was willing to throw their life away so casually. It all reinforces the American perception of the Japanese mentality as almost alien. Unfortunately, however, this use of psychological warfare backfires. When the time comes to finally press the war to its conclusion, America is too scared to approach the mainland with an invasion force, fearing more bloodshed and human loss in these senseless suicide attacks. They opt instead to force Japan's hand by using an ace up their sleeve, the atomic bomb. Imperial Japan had rolled the dice by throwing nearly 4,000 of Japan's best and brightest at the Americans, but the gambit backfired horribly, and now 210,000 innocent civilians are left to pick up the tab as they're turned to ash under the shadow of a mushroom cloud. It's 2:45 AM on August the 6th, 1945. A modified B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay catapults herself off a runway in Tinian, a small island above Guam. On board the aircraft is the pilot, Colonel Tibbets, and a crew of 11 other airmen. The most distinctive thing on board, however, is a new kind of weapon. It's called the Little Boy. It's an atomic bomb, the first weapon of its kind that humanity will ever detonate in anger. The crew plot their course to their target, the city of Hiroshima in southern Japan. It's described as a military asset, but 90% of the population is civilian. The residents of Hiroshima don't know it yet, but in exactly 6 hours and 31 minutes from now, a chemical reaction so fast that it's measured in microseconds will begin, and the result will be a nuclear explosion. The immediate blast is devastating beyond belief. One of the survivors, Mrs. Sasaki, pulls herself from the rubble, only to watch a man running toward the smoke. He has an unusual canter, and a distinctive clip-clop rings through the broken street as he presses onwards. He reminds her of a tap dancer with metal soles on his shoes, but as far as she can tell, he isn't wearing any. In fact, as she looks closer, she notices he doesn't have any feet at all. They've been blown off. With each step, his exposed shin bones are crushing against the crystallized sand, echoing out the distinctive brittle tone of a metal shoe. It's just the first stage of a terrifying spectacle that seals the fate of 140,000 people and will end the bloodiest war in human history, as an entire city is reduced to atoms and ashes. The decision to use the bomb was made by President Truman. He's relatively new to the war, with his predecessor Roosevelt having died in office in April 1945. When Truman takes office immediately after Roosevelt's death, he doesn't yet know anything about the bomb, or the 3 years of secret research that it took to make this weapon possible. But he's soon informed that America has a brand new toy to play with, something that can level cities in a single strike. Research for this weapon had started in 1942 after the physicist Albert Einstein wrote a letter of appeal to then President Roosevelt. In the letter, Einstein describes the possibility of a new weapon big enough to destroy an entire port and the surrounding area with one explosion. He urges President Roosevelt to begin research on atomic weapons before the Germans are able to build them for themselves. Roosevelt listens, and so begins the Manhattan Project, in which nearly 600,000 personnel would work in complete secrecy for 3 years. It's headed by US Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves. By July 6, 1945, the bomb was successfully detonated in New Mexico. The weapon had moved from a theoretical idea to a terrifying reality. However, by this stage, Germany had already capitulated, having unconditionally surrendered 2 months before, on May 7, 1945. America had raced to get this bomb ready before Germany, but now they were suddenly out of the war. US High Command may have finally had their hammer, but no nails. And so, after the first successful detonation of the atom bomb, it's almost immediately suggested that Truman should use this new weapon on the Japanese. But the new US president isn't sure. See, at the time of Germany's surrender, Japan was still in the fight, and Allied forces were determined to end the war with an unconditional surrender from Japan. A surrender which the Japanese were refusing to consider. To break their willpower, America had already been engaging in a campaign of destructive bombing raids on Japan. In March of 1945, America struck Tokyo with a 24-hour blitz of incendiary explosives. Given the fact that most of the city was built with wood, the results were atrocious. 100,000 souls perished in flames hot enough to melt concrete, and gale force winds caused by the fire were strong enough to rip children out of their parents' grasp, snatched away in an instant and swallowed by a raging inferno. But despite this onslaught from the skies, Japan seemed committed to fight. If the firebombing of Tokyo didn't make a difference, why would an atomic bomb? Truman didn't understand the strategic importance of the nuclear bomb. Not yet, at least. Things started to change once it became increasingly clear that the only way for the Allies to end the war on their terms might be to do things the hard way, invade Japan itself and remove the government. Given the absolute bloodbath on recent battles for Japanese-held islands in the Pacific, US military command estimated a minimum of around 1 million casualties on the American side alone. The human cost of an invasion would have been unthinkable, and not just for the Americans. Japan was training its civilians to fight in the case of an American invasion. Tactics included strapping mines to children and having them crawl under US tanks. An invasion of the mainland would have demanded unthinkable sacrifice. But the atomic bomb might get Truman the surrender he needed, without the death of millions in a protracted fight. It wasn't just the Japanese Truman was considering. Now that Germany was out the fight, Russia had the freedom to swing east and send soldiers to invade Japan from the north. Truman needed to wrap this fight up with Japan before the Russians got involved. He didn't want to see Japan split in two between the Western Allies and Soviet Russia like Germany had been. If he wanted a surrender from Japan without a sea of American blood and without a possible Soviet occupation, he would need something to end things quickly. The atomic bomb suddenly seemed like the perfect solution. He approved of the use of a nuclear strike on Japan, and on the 26th of July 1945, he issued his last warning: surrender now or face prompt and utter destruction. Tokyo was silent. And with that, the first domino had fallen. A Holocaust would be unleashed in Hiroshima. 5 days after his ultimatum, the Little Boy, the nuclear bomb that would be dropped, was fully assembled in the island of Tinian and ready for use by July 31st. 6 days after that, the Little Boy is loaded onto the Enola Gay, which is airborne by 2:45 AM local time on the 6th of August. William Sterling Parsons, the weaponeer upon the Enola Gay, is concerned about an accidental detonation during takeoff, so he only partially loads the bomb until the plane is flying smoothly. The final stages of assembly won't be completed until the last moments before the bomb is dropped. The flight from Tinian to Hiroshima is uneventful. Japan's air defence capabilities have already been whittled down to nothing. The path to the city lays open. The flight takes around 6 hours and 30 minutes. Just before the Enola Gay makes it to Hiroshima though, there's a problem. At around 8 AM Japanese time, the air raid siren in Hiroshima begins to wail over the city's PA systems. They've been rumbled. The scout plane ahead of the Enola Gay had been spotted flying overhead. Not a good start. Tragically, however, the warning isn't heeded. For the residents below, one lone bomber isn't much of a concern. People continue going about the day. Walking to school, eating breakfast, taking the bus, leaving for work. 250,000 individuals go about their morning as they would any other day. At 8:15 exactly, the Enola Gay is right over Hiroshima. Weaponeer Parsons puts the final pieces of the bomb together. It's set to explode in the air, just above the city. Everything is ready now. Over the intercom, the crew hear, "Bomb away." It will take 44 seconds for the bomb to fall from the Enola Gay and to its place of detonation. Immediately after dropping the payload, Colonel Tibbets pulls a hard right and turns almost 180 degrees. He has 44 seconds to separate himself from ground zero. As the bomb is slung forward by the momentum of the plane, the aircraft itself turns full heel. The Enola Gay's engine will turn red hot as Tibbets pushes the plane to its limit in order to get as much distance between his crew and the explosion as possible. At the moment of truth, there'll be a measly 10 miles between them. A crewman, Sergeant Bob Caron, will be the only member of the crew who's able to see the bomb as it erupts. At around 8:16 AM, the Little Boy is approximately 600 meters from the ground. A conventional explosive inside the bomb goes off, compressing the uranium material into a supercritical mass. 1 microsecond later, a neutron slams into the pressed uranium. It's so dense that it's impossible for the neutron to miss the nucleus of a uranium atom. Once an atom is struck, it shatters, releasing more energy and more neutrons. Only another microsecond has passed, but a chain reaction has already begun. Nuclear fission. More and more uranium atoms are smashed to pieces as new neutrons tear through the uranium like shrapnel. Within milliseconds, the entire reaction is complete, and an explosion has occurred. Only 2% of the uranium on board was able to achieve nuclear fission, but the results are astounding. A flash bright enough to pierce through human eyelids bursts across the landscape. Some even report being able to see the bones in their hands as they cover their eyes. Bob Caron is awestruck. He trembles into his radio. It's like a peep into hell. For those below, this is not a peep, but a reality. As a 15 kiloton explosion erupts through the city, some 50,000 people are vaporized instantly. The flash of the explosion simply vanishes them into thin air. The heat, around 7,700 degrees centigrade, is hotter than the surface of the sun. It's enough heat to instantly vaporize absolutely anything within a kilometer of the epicenter. All that remains of someone caught in a blast is a shadow on the ground where they once stood. Within seconds of this initial blast, the mushroom cloud already forms and begins to tower over the demolished city. A shockwave now sallies out from the centre, with the strength to knock over every building within 2 kilometres. Those dazed and confused by the blinding flash and the thunderous rupture are suddenly knocked up into the air or crushed alive under falling structures. The blast is so extreme that the crew of the Enola Gay compare the shockwave to anti-aircraft fire, as the plane is rattled around in the sky, still some 10 miles from the epicentre. Tibbets shouts to his crew to hold on to something. They survive the initial blast, and there's nothing left but to look back in horror as they head home. The mission was a success. By 8:18 AM, the mushroom cloud stands at 40,000 feet in the air, and those who survived find themselves in the midst of hell itself. As the mushroom cloud pours fresh air into the epicentre, an abundance of oxygen is dragged onto the roaring flames, stoking an already punishing fire into a positive inferno. Everything begins to melt, including the people trapped in this nuclear storm. We don't have exact numbers, but between 20 to 40,000 people are roasted alive in the flames and superheated wind. At the same time, those who are further away from the blast centre are knocked unconscious. When they open their eyes, they'll see the consequences of this mayhem firsthand. As they come to, they must have felt that they'd woken up in hell. By 8:20 AM, virtually no building is left standing, just a desolate wasteland filled with thousands of voices crying out in pain, screaming for help, screaming for water for their burns, screaming in agony. Melted flesh and skin seep into what's left of the pavement. Many scream for their family members. They'll never find them. And a staggering portion of those left alive are so horrifically burnt by the explosion that they're completely unrecognisable, as their facial features are mutilated and replaced instead with blackened skin and exposed flesh. Those who can run to the river in order to save themselves from burning alive. It won't help them. They'll be boiled alive as the heat begins to sink into the water. There are so many dead in the Aoi River that survivors reported not being able to see any gaps between the bodies. It no longer resembled a stream of water, but an ocean of charred corpses, impossible to tell apart from each other. Thousands more die with each passing minute.
Remember, I remember. A big light comes, very strong one. I never see so strong. I do not know what is happening. My friend, she and I are always together, but I could not find her. So dark it gets, so red like a fire. All is smoking dark red. I cannot see anyone. Many people run. I just follow. Pretty soon like fog, red fog, and gray, and people down all around me. Many people look so awful. Skin come off, just awful. Makes me so scared, so afraid. I never knew such hurt on people. Not human. I think if I'm in hell, it is like this.
By 8:25, just 9 minutes after the explosion, the death count is estimated at around 100,000 and counting. By 8:45, the majority of the shock from the explosion has passed, and those left standing have the task of finding help or helping others, and the local authorities, or what's left of them, start to try and bring order to the chaos. It's an impossible task. The sky has turned completely dark. Irradiated ash and black rain pour down over the city, and the surrounding mountainside erupts into a catastrophic wildfire. Streams upon streams of survivors begin to pour out of the devastated city. Many have skin left red and charred from the intense heat. Some have no skin at all. They march forward hopelessly, in some attempt to find some refuge. The deluge of fire creates another instant problem: crippling dehydration. Nearly every survivor account mentions that within the first minute or two after detonation, a perishing thirst sets in. The superheated environment robs the air of any moisture, and with each breath, the survivors pull this moistureless air into their lungs and airways, leaving them bone dry. Every breath makes you feel as though your throat is on fire. Of the chorus of screaming and crying through the black smoke, the most commonly heard request is mizu, the Japanese word for water. As the wounded drag themselves to makeshift shelters and improvised medical treatment centres, the unthinkable scale of the horror begins to be understood, both in the number of its victims and the extremity of their suffering. But when President Truman hears the operation was a success, he's positively thrilled. This is a step in the right direction. With this new superweapon, he can bring the Japanese to heel. He's so confident in the approach that just a few hours after the explosion, whilst irradiated survivors are still picking the wounded out of the smoking wreck that used to be a city, he makes another declaration: surrender now, or there's more to come. At this point, however, Japan has become as much a victim of internal division as it has of the bombings. Behind closed doors, the Japanese leadership scrambles to give the Americans an answer. Some hardliners, especially those in command of the military, are still determined to fight on. To them, this is just another bomb. While the Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo do their best to move the country towards a surrender, the pro-war camp makes sure to stall and delay any decision. 3 days have passed since Truman's demand to surrender, and they receive no official response from Japan. The US President keeps his word. On August 9th, another bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, the Fat Man. This time, made from plutonium instead of uranium. It's even more devastating than the hell unleashed in Hiroshima. The initial death count is lower. The bomber crew missed the center of the city. But with these new atomic bombs, accuracy is no longer a crucial factor. Around 65,000 die, and a city is erased, as hell on earth is unleashed yet again. Truman remains positive about the use of nuclear weapons. He can see Japan beginning to falter under the strain. The end of the war is finally in sight. Truman orders for the construction of a third bomb, but Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, tells Truman he may have to wait a month for it to be processed. Truman is not happy about this. The Soviets officially declared war on Japan on August 9th, the same day of the Nagasaki bombing. In an entire month from now, Stalin could have Russian boots in Japan. Not good. On August 10th, the day after the bombing on Nagasaki, President Truman has a meeting with Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The agenda is to discuss the effect of the Little Boy atomic bomb detonation in Hiroshima. It's the first time President Truman receives a full report and pictures of the carnage, including before and after images of the city. He's horrified. Truman's attitude visibly changes within an instant, and this conversation will lead to a decline in his physical health as he becomes psychologically haunted by the shocking details and the knowledge that he himself is directly responsible. As President Truman listens on with horror, Stimson continues to explain that 100,000 people died within the first hour of the bomb's explosion, and that many, many more will likely die from acute radiation exposure. It's a problem that the Japanese don't fully understand, and neither do the Americans. Not yet, at least. Around this time, US Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, the commander of the Manhattan Project, is called in front of the US Senate to explain the consequences of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When he's asked about radiation poisoning, he describes it as a very pleasant way to die. The victims will quickly go comatose before passing away without suffering. He couldn't be more wrong, but the Senate takes him at his word. America won't fully understand the horror of radiation exposure until nearly a year later, in May 1946, when an atomic scientist, Louis Slotin, accidentally drops a screwdriver while working on a plutonium core, researching a new series of atomic weapons. One slip of the hand, a dropped screwdriver, and a signed death warrant. Louis isn't supposed to be in the lab at all. He's recently tried to resign for moral reasons, having been utterly disgusted after hearing about the devastation in Hiroshima just 9 months ago. He was only allowed to resign on the condition he would train a new scientist to take his place. It was while mentoring his replacement that he found himself handling a plutonium core at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, the same place where the Manhattan Project had begun. Slotin was using the screwdriver to manually keep 2 beryllium half-spheres from closing around a core of plutonium. It's a process known as tickling the dragon's tail, in which you essentially edge a plutonium core close to criticality without allowing it to become supercritical. The idea is that this experiment will allow scientists to better understand exactly how much nuclear material is required for a critical mass, the point at which a nuclear explosion can occur. In this case, it was 6.2 kilograms of plutonium. Researchers call it the Demon Core. We'll soon see why. As Slotin's hand slips, the 2 beryllium half-spheres clamp shut on the plutonium, causing an instant supercritical event. As soon as the screwdriver leaves his hand, he throws himself between the core and the 7 other people in the building. A bright blue flash and a wave of heat washes over the room. People start screaming. The security guard sprints away, abandoning his post completely. Slotin knocks one of the beryllium half-sphere clamps off, stopping the reaction instantly, but the damage is already done. When Slotin stood between the core and the 7 other researchers, somewhere between 10 to 21 sieverts of radiation was poured into his body within a fraction of a second. We know today that this is 4 times the lethal dose of radiation exposure. He's now a dead man walking. The researchers at Los Alamos don't know this. They do the best they can. An ambulance is called. While waiting, Louis remains in the lab. The others have already evacuated. He uses his last strength to sketch an incredibly detailed picture of where everybody was standing at the time of the event, so that future scientists can understand how radiation damage works. It's a heroic feat, considering what comes next. By the time the ambulance arrives, Slotin is already vomiting and is convulsing with explosive diarrhea. This is the beginning of 9 days of unimaginable suffering. Once he gets to the hospital, he continues to vomit and excrete watery diarrhea from his bowels. His extremities swell up to over twice their size. The doctors plunge them into ice water. It doesn't help. Blisters form under his skin, then burst, never to heal again. His body is pumped with fresh blood to assist his damaged bloodstream and replace what's lost through the hemorrhaging pustules. His body begins to turn blue from cyanosis. Eventually, the blue patches split open and bleed. His blood is unable to coagulate into scabs. He loses more blood. Then, the same begins to happen in his mouth. Before long, entire sections of his skin begin peeling off. More blood is lost, more blood transfusions are given, 7 in total before he dies. Towards the final days, necrosis sets in, first in his limbs and then in the lining of his blood vessels. By day 7, every stem cell in his bone marrow is gone. He suffers from jaundice, acute thrombosis, extreme epithelial damage in his intestines. His immune system becomes compromised as the radiation mutates his own DNA. He can't make any more white blood cells. He can't make any more red blood cells. He can't make any more cells at all. The bacteria in his own stomach begins to attack his digestive system and surrounding organs as his immune system falls apart. Sepsis begins shortly after, then gangrene. Organs shut down, then tissue death. His bloodstream stops functioning properly, liver failure, followed finally by total organ failure and death. He was suffering on the hospital bed for 9 days. It was a harrowing way to go. The doctors at Los Alamos Hospital are scarred for life. They were not trained for this and never could be. Within hours of his death, Los Alamos doctors begin to perform an autopsy. They're curious about how radiation kills. At this stage, there has never been any rigorous scientific investigation into radiation poisoning. The atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima 9 months ago, but it won't be until 1946 that American scientists see the damage firsthand. As they slice him open, they are immediately confronted with a horrifying sight. The insides of Slotin's body looked unlike anything they had ever seen before. It did not resemble the organs and physiology of a human. What they saw was a mass of rotten flesh and partially decomposed organs, no longer separated by intramuscular tissue or fat. Now simply a pile of biological refuse, like the messy floor of an abattoir. One large, indistinguishable, rotten organ sat in his torso cavity. He had died while decomposing from the inside out. The only saving grace was that Louis Slotin had successfully managed to save the lives of the 7 researchers in the room with him when he threw himself in front of the radioactive burst. But nobody could call this a hero's death. Let's rewind 9 months to 8:50 AM on August 6th, 1945. The atomic bomb exploded above Hiroshima 36 minutes ago. People know practically nothing about radiation poisoning at this stage, but the same unthinkably grotesque results are about to be unleashed on the tens of thousands of unsuspecting, injured, isolated, blinded, confused and terrified survivors of Hiroshima. What's more, while Slotin died from an immediate high-dosage accident, the citizens of Hiroshima will face deliberate radiation poisoning over the coming days and weeks, as dust particles are sucked into the center of the explosion, toxically irradiated, dragged up into the sky, and then rained down onto the city's survivors. This irradiated material that trickles down onto the victims is called nuclear fallout. It looks something like black snow. Slotin also died from radiation poisoning in a comfortable hospital, surrounded by qualified doctors. The people of Hiroshima, however, won't have access to the medical care or the painkillers that are available in a hospital, because no functioning hospital remains standing in Hiroshima. The Red Cross hospital remained partially operational, but most of the staff died in the immediate blast, and most of the hospital building was lost in the firestorm. Those remaining medical staff are themselves injured and have lost most of their medical supplies to the explosion. And now they are under an avalanche of survivors, covered in third-degree burns, vomiting from radiation sickness, carrying limbs that were blown off in the initial blast. One man is guided to the hospital by another survivor. When he gets there, he reports to the skeleton medical team. In his hands, he is holding his own eyeballs. On a typical day, the Red Cross Hospital Hiroshima would treat between 200 to 300 patients. By 5 p.m. on the day of the blast, they'll be completely overwhelmed with a staggering 12,000 patients, more severely injured than anything they'd ever seen, and with less than half their usual staff, no clean water, and no equipment. Dr. Tatsuichio Akizuki, a doctor at the hospital, wrote in his memoir that the hospital turned into a hell, with many survivors wandering in a daze, skin hanging off their bodies, eyes swollen shut, and faces melted. Another doctor, named Sasaki, a surgeon, is forced to perform improvised amputations without anaesthetic, make heartbreaking decisions about who to help and who to leave for dead. There are a lot of dead. Patients can't get to doctors because the hallways are piled with hundreds of corpses. People have died while waiting for help. A flood of vomit, excrement, blood, and melted flesh begins to make what little remains of the hospital unusable. The medical staff hunt to find anyone who is strong enough to help, to start dragging the dead outside into a pile, soon higher than the people still standing, left outside in a mass open grave. Now that the hospital floor is clean again, Sasaki and Akizuki can continue treating patients. As time goes on, things go from bad to worse. Sasaki, the surgeon, works for 3 straight days before collapsing from injury and exhaustion. Unlike the American scientists who witnessed Slotin's death, the Japanese doctors in the Red Cross have never seen radiation sickness before. They're confused as to why patients who seem to be recovering are suddenly getting sick, vomiting, bleeding from every orifice. Nobody knows what's happening to them or why. Over the coming days and weeks, parents will bring their children, sick from radiation, to the hospital. The doctors recognize the symptoms, but have no way to treat them. Parents wail at the feet of doctors as they're flatly told there's nothing to be done. Other survivors know even less than the doctors do. Akiko Takura is 20 years old at the time of the blast. She recalls the damages of radiation. After seeing people's skin hung off their body like rags, many are also badly burnt from the fire, and after hours of trying to survive, they're thirsty. As the black irradiated rain pours down from the sky, many survivors beneath make an effort to lay underneath the downpour, with their mouths open to catch the rain. They had no idea they were sealing the deal for some of the most terrifying deaths possible. Sadako Sasaki, one of the most well-known victims, survived the initial blast, but developed leukemia due to radiation exposure. She became famous for folding 1,000 paper cranes in a hope to recover, but died from radiation-induced illness in 1955 at the age of 12. You could say she survived for 10 years after the explosion. The reality is that it took her 10 years to die. Takako Ishida was 2.4 kilometers from the epicenter and was only 11 years old. When she finally had the strength to stand, she looked at herself in the mirror. She describes what she saw in the reflection as a red ogre. She was a victim of radiation burns. Later her face would turn black. She remained this way for years. She says, "When I remember 2 classmates, both of whom died at the age of 11, I cannot help but cry bitterly. It doesn't make sense that we were exposed to radiation at the same place, yet some died within a couple of days, while others like me still live even after some 60 years have passed." That's the terrifying thing about radiation poisoning. It's a roll of the dice. You never know if you've received a fatal dose or not. By December of 1945, another 40,000 people will die of radiation poisoning. Tallying the death count further than that is almost impossible, but the victims will continue to pile up over the decades, even if they're not fully recorded. The official death toll is 140,000 lives. Those lucky enough to survive the bombings will be shunned for the remainder of their lives as a stigma builds up around those exposed to radiation. People are terrified that it can be transmitted like any other disease, or that it will produce children riddled with birth defects. The consequences of the bombing resonate down the ages. In the wake of these new reports of radiation sickness, Truman continues to feel disgusted at his own use of the bomb. On August the 11th, he begins to backtrack, announcing that, "You have to understand, this isn't a military weapon. It's used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses." The government of Japan also begins to change course. Surrender seems like the only option, but the clock is ticking. On the 10th of August, Brigadier Groves writes to Truman with good news. That bomb that was supposed to take a month to build is almost completed. It will be ready in just a week. Truman panics and sends out a mass order. Nobody is to drop another nuclear bomb without his explicit order to do so. It's the beginning of presidential controls over nuclear weapons, and without it, the American army would have the final say over when and where to use them. Meanwhile, the Japanese army in Manchuria is being rolled back by a Russian onslaught. Stalin has joined the war, with crushing results. By August 15th, Truman gets what he wants. Japan surrenders. Their only condition is that the Emperor Hirohito remain in power. The US slap the request down, and Japan agrees to surrender unconditionally, although the US does eventually decide to keep Hirohito on the throne. With that, a war that began with soldiers on horseback ends with a weapon that can instantly annihilate people by the hundreds of thousands. Back at home, Americans are enthralled, and public opinion on the bombings is callous. 85% of Americans approve of the bombings in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a separate survey, 25% say they're disappointed that the war ended before America had the chance to drop more bombs. It's a painful example of the utter contempt that Americans had towards Japan by this stage of the war. Although the human cost to Japan is unthinkable, they come out of the war in a relatively decent shape. Although globally humiliated, they'll be firmly under the yoke of a new American world order, and the US will use her vast economic might to begin rebuilding Japan. The quality of life for the average Japanese citizen soars over the next decades. On the global stage, the biggest loser is Russia. Although they've annexed the Central and Eastern European states after their struggle against Germany, they've been unable to establish a major foothold in Asia. What's worse, the discovery of this new American superweapon has thrown the delicate balance of power into the air. Territory doesn't count for much when it can be vaporized in an instant. In order to secure his position as an equal to the US, Stalin gives the order for his scientists to build the bomb as quickly as possible. And in the same moment that World War II, the bloodiest conflict in human history, ends, a new conflict begins. It's called the Cold War. It will last far longer than World War II. Some argue it hasn't ended. During World War II, America was only ever able to field 2 nuclear bombs at any time. Both were atomic bombs, delivering a payload of around 15 kilotons. As of 2015, 70 years after Hiroshima, the US and Russia have a combined number of around 8,500 of these weapons, oftentimes with kilotons in the hundreds. These new hydrogen bombs are powerful enough to make the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like veritable firecrackers. they can deliver a yield up to 80 times more powerful than the little boy atomic bomb. What's more terrifying is that if you live near a military base, industrial asset, or dense population centre, one of these missiles is pointed at you right now. Should it be launched, it would take less than 30 minutes to reach you. If you receive any warning at all, it'll be around 5 minutes before impact. 5 minutes to prepare for a nuclear strike that would dwarf the bombs of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. In 1945, the world was thrown under the shadow of a mushroom cloud, a shadow which still hangs over us today. The possibility of a total nuclear holocaust and the end of civilization. If you'd like to know more about nuclear weapons, we'll have another video coming soon on what would happen if a bomb was launched today, based on this incredible book, Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen, which was also invaluable in our research for this video. If you'd like to see that, give us a subscribe so you don't miss it. I've been Jake, cheers for watching.